the bag of explosives that Stauffenberg leaves in that room, it gets in the way of someone, it hits someone on the leg, and he just picks it up and moves it behind a solid oak table leg away, tragically, from Adolf Hitler. The British come up with one of the greatest intelligence coups, one of the greatest intelligence operations of all time. He's gone on another mission to finish off the Japanese carrier force. There's now just one carrier left, the Hiryu, but this time the Japanese know they're coming. This is the greatest challenge in my career, folks. This is the pinnacle. We're looking at World War II, the Second World War, and we're looking at some of the classic TV shows and movies and find out what they have to tell us about the course of that monstrous, destructive, and enormously important war. Let's get into it.
The Führer is pleased to invite you back to the library for the signing ceremony. Prime Minister, Duce, Monsieur le Président Conseil, Excellencies, gentlemen.
The first movie I've chosen is actually set before the outbreak of war. It's Munich, the edge of war, and it depicts the Munich Conference in 1938. This was a conference attended by the great powers of Europe. You've got the Brits here, we can see Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister. You've got the French, the Italians, the Germans. It's in Germany. Hitler's invited them to Germany. And this conference, and you can see it's wonderful how it's depicted, all of the officials and soldiers and politicians, they've all come together to work out how Europe can avoid war whilst allowing Hitler to realise some of his territorial ambitions. He's invaded Austria. Next he wants Czechoslovakia, or parts of it. And in Munich, in September 1938, the Brits and French thought they'd got Hitler to agree to a deal that allowed him to take some of Czechoslovakia, but not provoke a massive war. Love this drama of this signing ceremony. You've got Adolf Hitler there with his swastika on. You've got Neville Chamberlain. They really look like, the actors look like the people they're depicting. And they thought at this point, by signing this piece of paper, maybe they're avoiding war.
I urge you to treat the undertaking given by Hitler with the utmost caution. An agreement over the Sudetenland is one thing, but this other document...
Yes, I know. Horace, look, if there's one thing I've learned from my dealings with Mr. Hitler, is that you can't play poker with a gangster without any cards up your sleeve.
But what if he breaks his word? Then you're going to be made to look like a fool.
Yes, well, if he breaks his word, the world will see him for who he truly is.
You've got Chamberlain saying, look, I know that Hitler might break his word, but Britain hasn't got any cards to play at the moment. We're not ready for war, and I want to put Hitler in the position as if he does break his word, the rest of the world will be on our side.
Well, it'll unite the Allies, might even bring the Americans on board. And if I'm made to look a fool, well, it's a small price to pay. Horace, I can only play the game with the cards I've been dealt.
And Chamberlain has become one of the most demonised prime ministers in British history for giving in to Hitler at Munich. But in this scene, you see the writers trying to say, well, maybe Chamberlain was playing a game here too. Maybe he knew Britain wasn't ready for war. They'd be ready a bit later, a year or two later, and that time they would have global opinion on their side, because it was clear that Hitler was the one to break this deal. And here you see the movie depicting one of the iconic moments of the 20th century, one of the key moments in the build-up to war. He waves the piece of paper and announces, "We will have peace in our time." The crowd went crazy. He went to Buckingham Palace. People dared to hope that war had been averted, but we now know that it hadn't been. Just 6 months later, Hitler reneged on the deal. He invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia. Less than a year later, he would invade Poland. Arguably, Chamberlain's gamble backfired. Hitler became more aggressive, more land hungry after the Munich Conference.
You've redecorated, Logue.
I made it cozy. Some fresh air. They are, darling.
I'm a thistle sifter. I'm a sieve of sifted thistles and a sieve of unsifted thistles. A sieve of sifted thistles and a sieve of unsifted thistles. Because I'm a thistle sifter.
Darling, make sure it's not switched on.
Remember, the red light will blink 4 times, and I've asked them to turn it off. Because we don't want that evil eye staring at you all the way through.
In the King's speech, they tell the story of the outbreak of war. Munich failed. Germany invaded Poland in September 1939. And days later, Neville Chamberlain delivered an ultimatum to Hitler. It would be war unless Hitler withdrew his troops. Hitler didn't, and so on the 3rd of September 1939, Britain and its empire and Commonwealth found itself at war with Germany. And a few hours later, the King, George VI, known in his family as Bertie, played by Colin Firth here, he goes on the radio to deliver a message as well. The problem is he hated public speaking. He had a stutter. And this movie is based on the true events around him overcoming that stutter, working with an Australian speech therapist.
I'm sure you'll be splendid.
"40 seconds, sir."
Logue.
The speech therapist was called Lionel Logue, and the wonderful story is that his grandson found his personal papers like locked up in an attic somewhere with lots of letters between him and the King and his diary, and even a copy of this speech, the one he delivered on the 3rd of September, that was all annotated so that the King would be able to say it without stuttering. So this is a wonderful scene based on what we've learned about their relationship through the discovery in that attic.
However this turns out, I don't know how to thank you for what you've done.
Knighthood? Forget everything else and just say it to me. Say it to me as a friend.
It's a very powerful scene because it's a moment of huge importance for the King himself, delivering that message that no leader wants to give, saying you're taking your country into another terrible war. But it's also a huge moment for Britain and its empire. The Second World War would transform Britain. It would throw Britain and its empire into the greatest, most destructive and expensive war the world had ever seen. And the Britain that emerged from that war would be one that was almost unrecognisable to the Britain that had gone in. I think you just get that sense in this scene of everything that's at stake.
In this grave, our perhaps the most fateful in our history, I send to every household of my peoples, both at home and overseas.
Great reminder here, you see in that control room, Jamaica, Kenya, those names. Britain at the time still ruled over the largest empire in the history of the world, something like a quarter of the Earth's surface. This was a massive global force that was now at war with Germany.
With God's help, we shall prevail.
It's very good, Bertie. You still stammered on the W.
I had to throw in a few, so they knew it was me.
George VI there claiming that he left a few stammers in so that the public would know it was him because he was famous for stammering. Now, that line is in the diary of Lionel Logue, so it seems that it was actually said by George VI that day after that broadcast. And Colin Firth, the actor, apparently did absolutely certainly want to keep that line in.
Sie! Herkommen. Warum haben Sie sich nicht verbeugt?
Entschuldigen Sie.
This is a very powerful scene from The Pianist. It shows how the Germans quickly occupied Poland through the autumn, the fall of 1939, and then they began to pass a series of restrictions and infringements on the rights of the Jewish people of Poland. The Jewish population was forced to wear a white armband with a blue star on it so that it would be immediately obvious to everyone that they were Jewish, and people reacted accordingly. And from this point onwards, there is just a ratcheting up of the abuse, of the discrimination, and eventually the mass murder that was inflicted on the Jewish population of Poland and beyond as the war expanded.
Euch ist der Gehweg verboten. Nimm die Gosse mit dir.
This movie is based on a true story, and indeed Roman Polanski, the director, who was Polish and experienced the Polish Holocaust during the Second World War, he brought some of the things that he remembered as a child into the curation of this film. When Polanski was scouting for this movie in Poland, he actually met someone on the street whose family had helped Polanski's family survive. They'd kept them hidden, and they'd allowed them to avoid being sent en masse to the concentration camps, the gas chambers, the extermination camps of the Holocaust. This is a scene from the first few months of World War II. We have a man called George Elser. He's featured in this movie 13 Minutes. And he is coming up with an ingenious plan to assassinate Hitler. There was something like 45 assassination attempts made against Hitler during World War II, but this was certainly one of the most ambitious and ingenious and came very close to succeeding. He knew that Hitler would be speaking at that time, on that date, and so he went into this beer hall and created a space behind the speaker's podium and then a false door and packed it with explosives. You see him doing it in this scene. I think he correctly thought that if he could get rid of Hitler, if he could kill Hitler, that would remove one of the impediments to making peace. It was Hitler who wanted this war. It was Hitler who was driving this war forward. And if Hitler was taken out of the picture, well, maybe the world would be at peace.
Wir grüßen unseren Führer mit einem dreifachen Sieg! Sieg! Sieg!
It's a really powerful scene, this. You get the Nazis packed into this room, giving out their Sieg Heils. You get such a sense of the aggression, the militarism of the Nazi regime, and the devotion to Adolf Hitler, who at that point seemed to be leading them to victory after victory. Things would change.
Heil Hitler, Herr Elser. Heil Hitler.
Mahlzeit.
The plot narrowly fails. There's bad weather, and so Hitler is passed a note that says he has to cut short his visit because he has to get the train home rather than an aircraft. And as a result, he leaves the beer hall 13 minutes before that bomb goes off. That's why the movie's called 13 Minutes. It's one of the nearest misses in history. You think how things would have been different?
Wir beklagen den Tod von 7 unschuldigen Menschen, die Sie auf dem Gewissen haben.
7 Männer und Frauen, zum Beispiel eine Aushilfskellnerin, verheiratet, 2 Kinder. Ein Flötist des Gau-Musikzugs, er hinterlässt eine Frau und eine heranwachsende Tochter.
Was haben Ihnen diese Menschen getan? Wer gibt Ihnen das Recht, sie zu ermorden?
Elsa was taken into captivity. He endured unimaginable torture and solitary confinement for 5 years. Amazingly, he almost lived to see the end of the war. He was executed in the very last weeks of World War II.
Our ships have been sunk. Marines scattered all over the harbor.
German warships passed the Oslofjord fortress tonight after engaging with the fortress batteries and has continued onwards. German warships...
The Germans have invaded Denmark and Norway. This is a Norwegian movie called Narvik, Hitler's First Defeat. And it talks about really the first big bit of fighting since that invasion of Poland. There's been something called the Phony War, the British and French waiting to see what Hitler would do, months going by, not much going on, and then Hitler launches his northern blitzkrieg up through Denmark, across into Norway. He wants to secure critical resources in Norway and also the iron ore coming from Sweden. Iron ore so important for the modern armaments industry. And so suddenly the Second World War has really started to intensify. The Norwegians weren't able to put up a huge amount of resistance to Hitler's forces as they marched up through the country.
Oder wir schießen!
Das wird nicht passieren.
Where are you going?
I'm coming with you.
No, I'm doing this alone.
A primary German focus was punching straight up Oslofjord towards the Norwegian capital Oslo, but they also sent ships around to try and secure the coastal towns of Norway to make sure that the Allies couldn't intervene. Narvik's actually way up north. It's 130 miles or so inside the Arctic Circle, so hence the snow and the darkness. But this is a battle simultaneously going on right the way the length of Norway.
What the hell were they doing? I can't believe it.
Pull back!
Colonel, this is in direct violation of...
I can't have the entire town blown into pieces.
You can see the Norwegian commander here makes the decision that I think many Norwegians did make up and down the country. Is why just sacrifice the civilians, why sacrifice their own men in what they thought was probably a hopeless struggle. So here we've got an interesting scene from the movie where it's showing local Norwegians taking the fight to the Germans, as the Germans are in fact trying to stave off an invasion by the Brits. And Narvik became a key target for the British, the Royal Navy, in this campaign. Elsewhere, the British and French campaign didn't go that well, but they were able to secure Narvik. They were also able to inflict a pretty serious naval defeat on the Germans, who suffered considerable losses at sea, which would be important later in the war. After all the celebrations and the fact they'd had managed to drive the Germans out of Narvik, you see the German response, which is sending in air power to hit the city. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, coming in to smash the city. There was a sound of a dive bomber thrown in there, the famous horn that you get on those Stuka dive bombers. I saw horizontal bombers in the shot, but that, that's fine. So despite some success in Narvik for the Norwegians, the Western Allies, in the end the Germans do come back and they make that city in Norway untenable for the Allies. And eventually the British and French have to withdraw. Germany completes its occupation of Norway. But by that time, the action has shifted south. on the 10th of May 1940, the Germans launched their extraordinary attack of France and the Low Countries. The Nazis invaded Western Europe. It was the start of one of the most dramatic and one-sided military campaigns in the 20th century. The German blitzkrieg punched a hole through the French forces defending in eastern France. They surged to the Channel coast, they cut the Allied forces in half, and they pushed inexorably back the British, the Belgians and the French that were stuck in northern France and Belgium. By the end of May, less than a month later, the British, French and Belgians, they were surrounded, clinging on to the Channel coast around the port of Dunkirk. You can see some of them waiting on the beach, the long sandy beach there, but there's a huge queue of people waiting to go on that so-called mole. That's a breakwater. Much of the port had been destroyed by German aerial bombardment, but this mole, this one breakwater, was still able to be used, and ships could go alongside it, take people off and head back to Britain. The trouble is there weren't enough ships and not enough people were being taken off those beaches, and the Germans were pressing ever closer. Men on the beaches really feared German Luftwaffe attack, air attack, and here you see the dreaded Junkers 87, the dive bomber with its siren that made that piercing, screeching sound, and one big 500-pound bomb under its fuselage, 4 smaller bombs on its wings, and again they would attack the beach. And you can see the soldiers here just felt themselves to be, wide open, with very little shelter. And what many people have commented about this scene they find remarkable is the discipline of the British Army. Even when thrown into chaos by German air attack, they get up, they dust themselves off, and they get back in their long lines waiting to be evacuated. And that's something that eyewitnesses do report during the Dunkirk evacuation.
Where's the bloody Air Force?
In the end, Dunkirk was an astonishing success. The British managed to cobble together a fleet of boats and ships, and they managed to evacuate in the space of just over a week 338,000 men, British and French soldiers, from that beach. If the Germans had managed to completely crush that pocket, overrun that Dunkirk perimeter, then all of those men would have been lost. It's very hard to see how the British Army could have been rebuilt after that, with so many of its professionals gone into captivity. So despite losing the Netherlands, France, Belgium to German occupation, at least the core of the professional British Army was able to escape, and they would be able to rebuild in the months and years that followed over the Channel in Britain.
Turning once again to the question of invasion.
We're just a few days after those scenes in Dunkirk now. This is the 4th of June 1940, but the situation has changed. The British have been able to rescue lots of their soldiers off the beaches of Dunkirk. And Winston Churchill is now dealing with a political crisis back home with a bit more confidence. There are those within the Conservative Party, there are those within the country who think that Churchill ought to make peace with Hitler. But he's now getting up in the House of Commons on the 4th of June, and he's issuing one of his greatest speeches, saying there will be no peace with Hitler, Britain will fight on, and Britain will never surrender.
But I have myself full confidence that if all do their duty, if nothing is neglected, and the best arrangements are made, as they are being made, we shall prove ourselves once more able to defend our island home.
If the House of Commons looks a bit different to the one that you recognise, well, that's because it is. The House of Commons was actually badly damaged, destroyed really, during the Blitz, and So this is a depiction of the older House of Commons. The one we see today was built after the war.
If necessary, alone. At any rate, that is what we are.
This shows people listening to the speech on the radio, the wireless set. That's not true. The House of Commons was not broadcast. In fact, a BBC News announcer read out the speech later that evening, and the Winston Churchill version that you will have heard of him saying, "We shall never surrender," he recorded that decades later. He recorded that way after the war.
Aiding each other like good comrades to the utmost of their strength.
This is a superb performance by Gary Oldman. He becomes Winston Churchill. I interviewed him for the podcast a few years ago when this movie came out. He talked to me about the process he had to undergo, the makeup, the physicality of playing that role. It's the best Winston Churchill in movie history.
And all the odious apparatus of the Nazi rule, we shall not flag or fail. We shall go on to the end.
What I love so much about this scene is these are the words of Churchill. This is what he says in the House of Commons on the 4th of June 1940. This isn't a scriptwriter. Churchill says here, "We shall go on to the end." That was a revolutionary statement in June 1940 because Britain had been defeated on the continent. There were many people saying that they should just accept the result and make peace with Hitler. And it was Churchill who said, "No, we cannot make a deal with this monster and we must fight him to the point of destruction." Churchill realised that long before many other people in Britain and around the world. And Churchill was right.
We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender!
There you go, that's one of the greatest lines in the history of political oratory there. They're going to fight on the beaches and landing grounds, the fields and the streets. They're never going to surrender. And with that, Churchill set the agenda for the rest of the war. Britain would not surrender. Hitler had a fight on his hands, and it would be a fight to the death. And it would be a fight that Hitler could not win.
Rabbit Squadron.
Right, we've moved forward a month or two from that brilliant Churchillian speech. We're now dealing with the consequences of that speech, which is that Hitler had to turn his attention to defeating Britain. There'd be no peace, so Britain had to be knocked out of the war. First, Hitler tried air power, and that led to the Battle of Britain. And this movie is called The Battle of Britain. And it shows here German bombers flying across the Channel, trying to strike targets in southern England. And those bombers are pounced on by British fighters, interceptors. Among them, the Spitfire.
And a lot of you, keep your eyes open for the escort.
It's interesting to hear the British planes shooting in bursts because a Spitfire, for example, which was Britain's best fighter, it only had about 15 seconds of ammunition if you kept squeezing the trigger. So they had to fire in very short bursts. They'd try and bounce down on them, get some height, come down on them, use that speed and to shoot those German bombers. Very, very short bursts so they could save their ammunition for any other encounters they may have.
Red 3, yellow-nosed bastard, 6 o'clock high, coming down, now.
Roger, Red 3, I see him. Rabbit, break, right and climb.
here's a Spitfire with a German mesh spring. What the pilots typically do in that situation is just go into a dive and go into the tightest spiral they could, hoping to shake that following aircraft off its tail. And that puts enormous stress on the aircraft, but also on the pilot itself. So the pilot's in danger of blacking out. I've talked to Spitfire pilots who talk about the split second before blacking out is they knew they could push it that far and then they had to come out of the dive, had to come out of the turn at that point.
Behind you, Andy! On your tape! Get out, Andy! Jump!
Interestingly, most accounts of the Battle of Britain do emphasise the role of Spitfires, which are the more advanced, the more glamorous fighter aircraft, but there were many more Hurricanes than Spitfires in the RAF, in RAF Fighter Command at this time, and they shot down the majority of German aircraft. They don't feature too much in this scene. Well, this really gives you a sense of the chaos and the destruction and the horror of the Blitz. The movie's called Blitz, and it shows that time in British World War II history when Hitler turned his attention to destroying the British cities, British morale. The Battle of Britain was a defeat for the Germans. Their Luftwaffe failed to overcome the RAF. They failed to knock Britain out of the war. They failed to prepare the ground for an invasion of Britain. And so in frustration and anger, Hitler switched his attention to, well, softer targets really than the RAF, the cities of Britain. So through the autumn, the fall of 1940 and into 1941, you get consecutive nights of savage bombing raids against British cities. London, Manchester, Coventry, Liverpool. The Battle of Britain had taught the Germans it was too costly to try and bomb during the day, that the British fighters took a terrible toll on German bombers, so instead they came across at night. And they would unleash fire and high explosives on civilian areas, docks, industrial areas, right across the United Kingdom. Around 43,000 British civilians were killed between September 1940 and May 1941 during this particularly intense period known as the Blitz. Hundreds of thousands were wounded and many more made homeless. Before the war, the British government had deliberately not built many, or hardly any, deep shelters for civilians in cities. And so when war broke out, people took it into their own hands. They just went down and spent the night sleeping in the Underground Railway, the subway stations around Greater London. So many of the iconic images from the Blitz are set with families and people just living down deep beneath the ground in these underground railway stations. There was one terrible moment though where that backfired for the people that were sheltering in one underground station, where on the night of October the 14th, 1940, a very, very big German bomb smashed right into the station and caused astonishing damage. In this scene, it's said to be London Bridge Station. I think that's because it's a very famous station, recognisable over the world. In fact, the real tragedy occurred at Balham Station, which is a station further south in southern London. Something like 70 people were killed in the bomb blast or were drowned in the aftermath.
Well, I work beside a man every day, and I can't help but have developed a bit of a crush on him.
Well, who is this man, so I can kick his ass?
No, there's no need to worry. It's been chased. We've never even met. He's a German.
Now I really want to kill him.
How do you mean you work alongside a German?
Well, each of us intercepts messages from a specific German radio tower. So we have a counterpart on the other side who's tip-tapping out the messages. Everyone types a touch differently, so you get to know the rhythm of your counterpart. Strangely intimate. I feel as if I know him so well. It's a pity he has a girlfriend, but that's why I disagree with you, Mr. Alexander. Because I'm in love with a co-worker of sorts, and we've never even met.
Right, so here we've got a depiction of Bletchley Park. Now, Bletchley Park was the top secret British government facility devoted to trying to hack into, try and decipher German codes, particularly the Enigma code. And this features Benedict Cumberbatch as the famous, the totemic scientist, the mathematician, Alan Turing, the man who would go on to help to usher in the era of information technology and invent a programmable computer, for example.
Why do you think your German counterpart has a girlfriend?
It's just a stupid joke, don't worry.
No. Tell me.
Well, each of his messages begins with the same 5 letters. C-I-L-L-Y. So I suspect that Silly must be the name of Fizamore.
It's impossible. The Germans are instructed to use 5 random letters at the start of every message.
Well, this bloke doesn't.
Love will make a man do strange things, I suppose.
In this case, love just lost Germany the whole bloody war.
Now, in fact, this movie really simplifies, it really dramatises this what was actually a very long, steady process. There was probably no particular eureka moment for Alan Turing. Instead, the Brits owed a huge amount to the Poles who captured vital equipment. They owed a huge amount to a daring British naval crew who boarded a sinking U-boat submarine and managed to steal an encryption machine, an Enigma machine, and code books as well. And so collectively, this allowed the British at Bletchley Park, Alan Turing and his colleagues, to really break into Enigma until by the end of the war, they were able to read German messages almost at will. Just a small thing here, you see Alan Turing running, and in fact, Alan Turing was almost an international standard runner. He ran a marathon in 1936 in about 2 hours 45 or something. He used to apparently run to London from Bletchley Park if he had to go for meetings in the capital. So he was a brilliant runner, as well as being one of the greatest mathematicians and certainly one of the greatest computer scientists of all time.
0600 hours, weather today is clear, rain in the evening, Heil Hitler.
That's it. Exactly. They send a weather report every day at 6 a.m. So that's 3 words we know will be in every 6 a.m. message. Weather, obviously, and Heil bloody Hitler. Heil bloody Hitler.
Here's the 6 o'clock message from this morning.
There is an element of truth in this scene. They worked out quite quickly that lots of these German messages would contain the phrase Heil Hitler. So if you know that this jumble of letters actually says Heil Hitler, well then you've already cracked those 6 unique letters for the day. It expedites the whole process.
What would the Germans think if we destroy their U-boats?
Nothing, they'll be dead.
No. No, you can't be right.
So our convoy suddenly veers off course. A squadron of RAF bombers miraculously descends on the coordinates of the U-boats. What will the Germans think?
The Germans will know that we have broken Enigma.
They'll stop all radio communications by midday, and they'll have changed the design of Enigma by the weekend.
Yes.
2 years' work. Everything that we've done here, it'll all be for nothing.
There are 500 civilians in that convoy. Women. Children. We're about to let them die.
Our job is not to save one passenger convoy, it is to win the war.
Our job was to crack Enigma.
Well, we've done that. Now for the hard part.
So this scene never took place, and it is quite simplified, but it gets to the key of a big issue of British handling of this decrypted information, is exactly when should you act on the information that you now know. And the British were in danger of letting the Germans know that they'd broken Enigma, because they started carrying out attacks on German supply vessels, for example, all around the North Atlantic. And that led one German admiral to question whether his communications were in fact secure. So these were the kind of debates that did go on in senior British circles. Should they act always on the information that they learned from breaking the Enigma code? Well, Bletchley Park played a critical role in the next chapter of World War II, which I want to talk about now, which is the sinking of the German battleship Bismarck off the coast of France in the middle of May 1941. The movie is Sink the Bismarck, and this scene is the final battle. Bismarck had left Norway just a few days before this for its maiden and its only voyage. It had cruised out to the North Atlantic, it had exchanged fire with some British warships way up near Greenland, near Iceland. It had destroyed HMS Hood. One of its shells had smashed through Hood's deck, blown up deep inside the ship, and the ship had been torn apart by a catastrophic explosion. After that battle with HMS Hood, Bismarck had sustained a little bit of damage, and it was decided that Bismarck would return to the French coast, occupied France, for repairs. And it sent a message saying it was heading for Brest. That message was intercepted, it was decrypted at Bletchley Park, and it was found out that Bismarck was heading for Brest. And that allowed the Royal Navy to intercept Bismarck on that voyage. The key vessel that could stop Bismarck was the aircraft carrier Ark Royal. And in mountainous seas, in terrible weather, in gales, these swordfish aircraft, so they're known as stringbads, quite primitive aircraft, open cockpit biplanes, they took off from Ark Royal and they went on a torpedo run towards Bismarck. Now, I've talked to one of the pilots who was on that mission. He's the man who claimed that he dropped that torpedo, he waited until there was a trough in the huge waves, he dropped it nice and deep, it went towards Bismarck and it struck Bismarck in the rudder. Her steering gear was jammed, and so she turned in a huge circle. She was ungovernable. She wouldn't respond to her rudders. She would not make it back to Brest, and that allowed the rest of the Royal Navy to catch up and close in. And that brings us to this scene in this movie where you see HMS Repulse, you see HMS King George V, two of the mightiest battleships in the Royal Navy. They close with the Bismarck with some other ships, and they administer the final lethal bombardment.
All guns out of action, except A turret, sir.
Where is your Luftwaffe now, sir?
I don't understand it. The Führer promised us. He will be along any minute now. You will see.
This took place. One of HMS Rodney's shells smashed straight into the superstructure of Bismarck and wiped out everyone on the bridge, probably killing the admiral and the captain at exactly that point. Once the big battleships had done their worst to Bismarck and she was just a smoking hulk, other smaller ships came in, and you see HMS Dorsetshire here launching torpedoes, and they would sort of finish. The idea was that they would finish off, they would penetrate the hull of Bismarck and send her to the bottom.
Going. Yeoman?
Sir.
Tell Dorsetshire to stand by to pick up survivors.
Aye, aye, sir.
In fact, she did sink. She rolled over and sank about 10:40 in the morning on the 27th of May, 1941. There were survivors in the water. Many of them were not picked up by the Royal Navy, by the British, because there was concerns that there'd be German U-boats operating. And to pick up survivors, you have to slow down, you have to stop in the water. And so only a fraction of Bismarck's crew were rescued from those freezing waters and lived to tell the tale of the final minutes of that destructive battle. Well, we've arrived in a different theatre of war now. The war is expanding, it's opening up, it's dragging more people in, and it is intensifying. The period between the summer of 1940 and the spring of 1941, with Britain and its empire pretty much fighting alone, which we've been talking about until now. You've got fighting the Battle of the Atlantic, you've got fighting the Battle of Britain, for example. That changes in the spring of 1941, when Germany launches an assault across Southeast Europe into the Balkans, into Greece, and then after that, they attack the Soviet Union. And that is the beginning of war on an unimaginable scale. Millions of men march into the Soviet Union in June 1941. It's the start of Operation Barbarossa. And the reason I've chosen this movie is it's set, and around that time, later in that year, the German troops have advanced as far as the outskirts of Leningrad, the Soviet city, now called St. Petersburg. And you just get a sense in this scene of the appalling conditions, the scale of the fighting, the ferocity of that fighting, the brutal decisions made by both sides, both led by savage authoritarian dictators, Stalin and Hitler. Here you see Soviet troops, some men out of uniform, so just civilians that have actually been rounded up. They are being forced to launch a suicidal charge against the attacking Germans. You've got this character here. She's shooting at anyone trying to retreat. Now, we do know that the Soviets did have so-called blocking detachments who were trained to shoot their own men if they saw them retreating from the battle. You see savage hand-to-hand fighting in the rain here. The fighting on the Eastern Front was of a magnitude almost unlike anything that had gone before. And you see fighting from Leningrad right up near the Baltic, all the way down through into southern Ukraine, all the way down to the Black Sea. At this point in 1941, as you can see here with the tanks enter the scene at the end, it does look like the Soviet Red Army was just outclassed by the German Wehrmacht. The Germans made massive advances. They surrounded hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops. They took millions of prisoners. They swallowed up miles upon miles of Soviet land. It looked like the Germans might be victorious. But then came a massive turning point. Not only were the Germans stopped at the gates of Leningrad, they were stopped just a few miles short of Moscow. They were very, very close to the Kremlin itself. But there was then a massive Soviet counterattack in the depths of winter in December 1941. And the Germans suffered terribly in plunging sub-zero temperatures. The Germans fell back. They had failed in their attempt to defeat Stalin, to capture Moscow in one short, sharp campaign. The Germans would fight on in the Soviet Union, but there was no quick, easy victory, and the stage was set for a brutal, years-long, attritional struggle. And in that struggle, the Soviet Union and Britain, now allies against Hitler, were about to be joined by a very important partner. I've chosen the movie Das Boot at this point. It's a German movie. It's based on a novel written by someone who served on a German submarine during the Battle of the Atlantic in the Second World War. The name of the author was Lothar Gunther Buchheim, and he served on U-96, and this follows what is effectively U-96.
Trennrechnung stimmt? Jawohl, richtig. Was ist denn eigentlich? 310? Eben! Warschau! Wollen wir euch jetzt zeigen? Was ist denn eigentlich passiert? Ja, U-32, Boot von Berthold. Der hat einen Geleitzug entdeckt, nicht weit von hier. 10 Stunden ist man dort.
So you see the German U-boats surfacing. It's worth remembering that German U-boats could travel much quicker at this point of the war on the surface of the water than down underneath the water. So the German U-boats spend a lot of time on the surface, making progress, trying to get towards the convoy, and it's only when it entered the attack phase it would go tactical and it would go below the surface and it would start hunting, moving around the convoy to unleash its torpedoes.
Auslaufender Geleitzug, 5 Kolonnen, fetter Brocken.
Sehen Sie Sicherungsfahrzeuge?
So these guys have found a convoy. Next question, any escorts in sight? Are there any destroyers? The destroyers represent a real threat to those U-boats. But if there's no destroyers, you can get it amongst the convoy and you can cause havoc.
Verdammt helle.
He says that damn moon, it's a full moon. Now, U-boats want to sneak in without being seen. When the moon's out, they're more like to spot the periscope or the conning tower of the U-boat and even the track of the torpedo as it's in the water. So they quite like a dark night.
Beide Maschinen AK voraus, hart Backbord auf 107 Grad gehen. Anlauf beginnt. Lage 50. Entfernung 2200. Geht. Da, die zweite sich überlappen.
It's amazing to have such a great movie that presents the Battle Atlantic from the other side. To see the action in the U-boat itself is amazing. The confined space, the communication, the fine-tuning between the course, the bearing and the speed at the U-boat steering, and then the activity going on down in the hull itself. Calculating the range and then shooting off those torpedoes.
Rohr 1 und 2. Feuererlaubnis. Rohr 1 und 2 fertig. Rohr 1 und 2 sind fertig. Rohr 1, los, los. Rohr 2 und 2, los. Rohr 3, Feuererlaubnis. Rohr 3, fertig. Rohr 3, los. Rohr 4, fertig. Rohr 4, los. Zerstörer voraus.
And then here comes the destroyer escort. As soon as the U-boat's been spotted by anyone in that convoy, as soon as they see a torpedo in the water, they can tell which direction it's coming from, and the destroyers would put full speed on and they'd race around to try and destroy that U-boat, particularly if it's on the surface before it's had a chance to dive. You get a sense of the alarm here, the panic when they have to do a crash dive. The whole crew has to scramble into position. You've got to get that U-boat underwater. You're no match for that destroyer on the surface. The little gun on the front of the U-boat can't possibly compete with the armament on the destroyer. You've got to get down, you've got to get below the surface and try and wriggle your way out of trouble.
Hat's erwischt.
Sound travels very effectively through the water, so they can hear the torpedoes strike home, but they can also hear the kind of rending and snapping of steel and metal. They can hear the ships coming apart and sinking to the bottom.
Da saufen 2 ab.
My grandpa was in the Battle of the Atlantic on the Canadian ships, and he said the horror was just not knowing when that U-boat torpedo could strike. It could be any time, day or night, for weeks on end as you're crossing back and forth across the Atlantic. So the just intensity of having to keep yourself at that peak of readiness must have just been so fatiguing. You see here the effect, perhaps that was an oil tanker, so their cargo's just burning. There would have been numerous nights on the Atlantic when the darkness would have been illuminated by flames coming from stricken ships. At the start of the war, there was an idea that U-boats might rescue the crews of the ships they sank, but that was just impractical because there wasn't space on the U-boats, and they weren't going to tow boats full of survivors back to friendly ports. They might get sunk while they're on the surface. It just, the practicalities didn't work. So the effect, so by this stage of the war, U-boat crews would just watch as their stricken enemy would jump in the water, and there was nothing they could do to save them. What a scene. Here we have Japanese aircraft taking off from this fleet of aircraft carriers to strike the headquarters of the US Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The movie's Pearl Harbor. And it's the day that everything changed, the day of infamy. It's December the 7th, 1941, when the Japanese Empire launched a surprise attack on the Americans, with whom at that time they were at peace. I like the way it shows the American aircraft parked next to each other on the airstrip there. There had been some concern that war with Japan might be imminent because it had been an uneasy peace. And the Americans had worried about sabotage from the ground, so they'd gathered all their aircraft together in the middle of the airfield so they were easier to protect from saboteurs. But that made them easy targets for Japanese air attack. To veterans of Pearl Harbor, and they do talk about just how surreal it was. You go from a peacetime Sunday morning, everyone's relaxed, life is easy, and suddenly the skies are filled with enemy aircraft. You've got bombers high up, horizontal bombers that are going to drop big bombs down from a distance. You've got torpedo bombers that are coming in at almost wave top height. They're going to attack ships by dropping torpedoes that penetrate their hulls and from underwater. You've got Japanese Zero fighters, they're strafing the ships, they're flitting around the sky. Rarely in history has there been a more dramatic change in the atmosphere than in that morning in Pearl Harbor. What you don't see here is the fact that the key American aircraft carriers were not in Pearl Harbor at the time. And you also don't realise, just from this scene, that the Americans were able to actually salvage, they were able to raise lots of the sunken and damaged warships from the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor and put them back into service later in the war. So the damage to the US Navy isn't quite as bad as it looks in this scene. That Japanese attack brought the USA into the war because the USA obviously declared war against Japan in retaliation. But critically, in the days that followed Pearl Harbor, Adolf Hitler announced that Germany was also declaring war against the USA. So following Pearl Harbor, you see the war in the Pacific, the war which Japan had been fighting against people in the Pacific, and the war in Europe fused together. So from December 1941, it's truly a global war involving all of the world's great powers.
Consider, the Jews are taken away. The German spouses will presumably inherit the property of the Jewish spouses, go to court, a death certificate will be applied for, and what happens to your secret killings then? No matter what you call them. The secret is out, dear friends.
Okay, we've moved forward a month. We've gone to January 1942. We're switching back to Europe because a very, very important meeting is taking place about which they made a movie. It's called the Wannsee Conference. It took place in a suburb of Berlin. The movie's called Conspiracy, and it shows this surreal meeting when many of the leading figures of Nazi Germany gathered together to go through the administrative process of coming up with the final solution, to go through the necessary stages to put genocide in place of Europe's Jewish people. Millions of Jews in Eastern Poland, in Russia, in Ukraine, in the Soviet Union, in the Balkans, all of those Jews are now have come under Nazi domination. And the Germans are trying to work out what to do with them. In this scene, as they're drinking fine wine and spirits and having a lovely meal in this lovely surroundings, they're basically hashing out how to get rid of or murder millions of people.
Deal with the reality of the Jew and the world will applaud us. Treat them as imaginary phantoms, evil in human fantasies, and the world will have justified contempt for us. To kill them casually without regard for the law martyrs them, which will be their victory. Sterilization recognizes them as a part of our species, but prevents them from being a part of our race. They'll disappear soon enough, and we will have acted in defense of our race and of our species and by the law. This fellow mentioned the law for the protection of German blood. I wrote that law. And when you have my credentials, then we'll talk about who loves the Jews and who hates them.
And this movie is very closely based on what we know about the proceedings of the Wannsee Conference. And you see this argument developing. Is it best just to drag Jews out in the street and shoot them, club them to death and eventually gas them? Or should there be, this is Germany, this is still a country that apparently has the rule of law. So what Colin Firth's character here is doing is say, look, I despise the Jews, but he is arguing they should be sterilized. If they commit genocide, if they kill them all, well, that will create martyrs. That will create global sympathy for the Jewish people. And these were the kind of discussions that were going on in this house, in the suburbs of Berlin. It's very interesting when you see the exterior of the house shown in this movie, that is the actual villa in which the meeting took place. This is a reasonably accurate movie. We're back in the Battle of the Atlantic. This is Greyhound. It's an astonishing scene giving us a depiction of a typical destroyer versus U-boat encounter in the North Atlantic. The grey seas, the cold, the tough conditions. We've got a destroyer, an American ship. The Americans are now in the war. As the Germans and the Soviets are slogging out on the Eastern Front, as in Germany, people are putting the finishing touches, this idea for a final solution, a genocide of Europe's Jews. And as Japan's advancing across the Pacific, this shows the Battle of the Atlantic, that ongoing battle that lasts from right at the beginning of the war to right at the end of the war. That battle's become even more important now, because now that the Soviet Union, Britain, and the United States are allies, supplies are pouring across the Atlantic to Britain and then from Britain to the Soviet Union. Those are supplies from North America, food, gasoline, armaments, tanks, aircraft. The Atlantic is the vital seaway. It's the joining piece between these three great allies. The Germans are doing what they can to interrupt those supplies, to sink those cargo ships. The Americans, the Brits, the Canadians are sending destroyers like this one, other vessels, aircraft out in the Atlantic, try and sink those German U-boats. And you get a great sense of that in this scene. I love the fact you can see Tom Hanks's character is just reeling under the pressure that being a destroyer captain entails. He was making decisions. He is spotting torpedoes. You can see torpedoes. You can see their track underneath the water. That's quite accurate. And I know that many destroyer captains were on their bridges for hours, for days on end. It took a terrible toll on their health. And you get a sense that here, Tom Hanks is making those personal calls that are keeping his ship alive. The U-boat surfaces, which means it's in terrible distress, and then it's pounded by American fire before it disappears in that great cloud of water and explosive debris. And that means that another one of Hitler's U-boats has been destroyed in the Atlantic. The arrival of the Americans in the Battle of the Atlantic really helped to turn the tide of that battle, ensured that more destroyers like this one could go out and protect convoys of supply ships, more destroyers like this one could go and hunt down German U-boats.
Signal bridge reports aircraft signals. Uncle William, sir. One nigger dog. What's the 41 and 42. Open fire to mark the target for that aircraft.
You see here different arms of the armed forces working together. And so if you're close enough to shore and these aircraft are able to land and take off in Iceland, in Scotland, in Northern Ireland, in Newfoundland, then you have a huge advantage. But there are gaps in the air cover, the so-called air gaps, when it was just up to the ships, the escort ships, to deal with the U-boats themselves, until they start bringing in more and more aircraft carriers so they could take aircraft with them. Overall, I think this is a pretty accurate depiction of a naval engagement between a destroyer and a U-boat, and it's just a reminder of the relentless battles that were going on day after day, weeks, months, years on end to keep those vital supply lines open. Without the Battle of the Atlantic, there would have been no D-Day, there'd have been no invasion of Europe. You've got to keep those supplies flowing across the Atlantic.
Gentlemen, you have all fought valiantly. You are a credit to your country. But I have to inform you that General Percival has decided, under the circumstances, to negotiate, as it were, a ceasefire.
You mean he's thrown in the towel, sir? What happens to us?
Colby, we are still a fighting unit, and you will do what you're told. You can start by destroying anything that might be of value to the enemy. Quickly, gentlemen!
1942 was, wow, it was a pivotal year in World War II. The Battle of the Atlantic's raging, fighting on the Eastern Front's raging. The Nazis are planning their Holocaust in a suburb of Berlin. And here we get the worst defeat in British military history. A couple of months earlier, just on the same day as the Pearl Harbor attack, the Japanese had also attacked the British Empire in Southeast Asia. The British at that point controlled Malaya, Burma, India, of course. The Dutch controlled Indonesia. And the Japanese had invaded Southeast Asia to gain many of those territories eventually. They'd advanced down the Malayan Peninsula in a sort of a blitzkrieg-like attack that just flummoxed and confused the British and Commonwealth units that were facing them. They'd reached the end of the Malayan Peninsula and they threatened Singapore. There were about 80,000 British and Commonwealth defenders of Singapore, double the number of the attacking Japanese. And yet the British commander on the spot made the decision to surrender that mighty British fortress. The water had been cut off, morale was at rock bottom. It was a decision that Winston Churchill regarded as probably the single worst decision, I think, of the Second World War by the British.
Lomax, my friend. I think we have just witnessed the fall of the British Empire.
That character says he thinks he just witnessed the fall of the British Empire, and in many ways he was right. Although Britain would emerge as one of the victorious allies in the Second World War, in many ways Britain would never recover. Well, it would never recover financially, but it would also never recover from the prestige of having had its Asian empire, or chunks of its Asian empire, overrun so easily by the Japanese. And it fundamentally undermined the legitimacy, the case for the British Empire in places like Burma, Malaya, but even into India in the years that followed. This is a pivotal moment, not just in the Second World War, but in British history.
What's happening?
This, taking place in February 1942, that big month, shows the Japanese assault on Darwin, the port in northern Australia. That was the biggest ever attack by a foreign nation on the nation state of Australia. After Pearl Harbor, the Japanese just went on this absolute bender, striking out in all different directions. They struck at Hawaii, they struck at other Pacific islands, they struck into Southeast Asia and Malaya and Singapore, we talked about. They struck into the Indian Ocean as well, but they also attacked Darwin in northern Australia. Just a series of attacks to try and keep the enemy back, to try and push back the enemy while they seized what they regarded as their primary objectives of the Pacific War. They wanted the resource-rich islands of Malaysia, Indonesia, they wanted Burma, they wanted Southeast Asia. If you'd been there in February 1942, you would have thought the Japanese Empire was unstoppable. It was on the march across thousands of miles of Asia and the Pacific, from Hawaii to the Indian Ocean and northern Australia. These were dark days in World War II for the Allies. So this is a very dramatic scene from the movie Anthropoid. We've come forward now, we're in May 1942, and this is a secret operation by special forces, really British trained special forces, to kill Reinhard Heydrich, that man that we saw in the Wannsee conference a couple of movies ago. He is the man really responsible for putting the Holocaust into effect, the liquidation of Germany's Jews, but he's also responsible for the monstrous violence and barbarism of the Nazi occupation right across swathes of Eastern Europe. He's number 3 in the SS. In fact, you see from his vehicle that he says SS3. So he's one of the most senior Nazis in the Third Reich, and certainly one of the most committed and brutal. And these Czech operatives, trained up by British special forces, they are in Prague to assassinate Heydrich. The movie's called Anthropoid because that's the name of the operation to kill this senior Nazi. You can see there that Heydrich does survive the blast. Indeed, he's fit enough to get up and discharge his weapon, but he then collapses back into the vehicle and he is wounded. He'll die of those wounds a week later. But it's not perhaps the unalloyed blessing that his assassins might have been hoping for, because that unleashes, that assassination attempt, that successful killing of Heydrich, unleashes a gigantic manhunt and massive punitive retaliation against innocent civilians in the area. As for the assassins themselves, the two British trained Czech assassins, they both escaped from the scene. They went into hiding, but they were betrayed. The Gestapo surrounded them. There was a savage battle. One of them was killed, and the other took his own life so he wouldn't fall into their hands. The assassination of Heydrich was the only government-sponsored assassination of a senior Nazi across the whole of the Second World War, so it really stands out. The aftermath was terrible. The SS were furious that one of their own had been taken, in fact, one of their senior commanders. And they falsely blamed a couple of local villages just outside Prague and exacted a terrible revenge. In two villages in particular, men and boys were murdered out of hand. The women and the girls were sent off to concentration camps. The villages were left as wastelands.
Get ready, Murray. We're not sneaking up on them this time.
Just after the assassination attempt on Heydrich in Central Europe, a battle took place midway across the Pacific that would change the course of the war. That battle was called Midway, and so's the movie. And I love this scene here because it shows a vital dive bombing attack on the Japanese carriers.
Here they come!
The Americans had broken Japanese codes. They knew where the Japanese were going, and so they ambushed the Japanese just off the island of Midway. The result was an extraordinary, anarchic battle that would see waves of American attacks against those Japanese carriers. This is one of them. So the Japanese carriers are protected, first of all, by their Zeros, by their fighters. The plan is their fighters stay high up in the sky and they're able to identify any aerial threats the Japanese carriers. They then dive down on them, pounce and shoot them down with their machine guns and their cannon. The American bombers are slower moving. They're vulnerable. They've also got a very predictable trajectory as they're diving to drop their bombs on the Japanese carriers. So they're filling the air with a curtain of supersonic rounds trying to shoot down any bombers that threaten them.
Altitudes! We got tears on our tail!
Dive bombers use their trajectory in order to aim their bombs. So they fly down straight at a target, then they come out, they pull out of that dive, and then they release the bomb at the exact right moment, and the momentum should carry that bomb to the target below. This is the afternoon of the 4th of June, 1942. In the morning, this character here, Dick Best, is flying his Dauntless dive bomber. He's taken off for an American carrier. He's been part of a successful strike that hit the Japanese carrier, the Akagi. that came out of the clear blue sky and rained devastating bombs down on that carrier. He's gone back to his aircraft carrier to refuel, and he's gone out on another mission to finish off the Japanese carrier force. There's now just one carrier left, the Hiryu, but this time the Japanese know they're coming. For dramatic effect there, you see that Dick Best has dropped the bomb right on the target, right on the Japanese rising sun. I don't think it was quite there. It's not super inaccurate though, because it did apparently drop it right amidships, just in front of the aircraft carrier's island. Now, interestingly, on the bridge of the Hiryu in the afternoon, this carrier, as is portrayed in the movie, you do get Admiral Nagumo. He is there, he's watching these dive bombers at just a few meters range, really. He's watching them as they soar down, and not just Dick Best, but 3 other bombs smash into the Hiryu, all in that forward section. So that if you look at a picture of Hiryu after this attack, it's like she's a can that's just been ripped open, and the foredeck has just been torn off, and there's just a gaping hole where fires are raging. And after losing 3 carriers in the morning, the 4th Japanese aircraft carrier is lost. It is a catastrophe for the Japanese Empire.
Now fly like geese!
Right, it's the month following Midway. It is now late July 1942, and we're switching back to another theatre of war. We're leaving the Pacific behind, and we've arrived in North Africa. After Italy entered the Second World War as an ally of Germany in the summer of 1940, that brought the Italian and British possessions in Africa into direct conflict. They were neighbouring empires. And from 1940 to 1942, you've got the British and Italians duking it out in East Africa and in North Africa. The Germans had joined in, they'd sent reinforcements, their Italian allies, and there'd been a series of back and forth battles across North Africa, from Libya into British-held Egypt and back into Libya. By the summer of 1942, things were looking pretty bad for the Allies.
Butcher and bombs!
The British were holding the Axis forces at the defensive position at El Alamein. If the Axis could push through those Allied defences, well, there was nothing stopping them reaching the Nile, reaching the Suez Canal and the oil fields of the Middle East. They're led by the charismatic, maverick, Scottish aristocrat Major David Stirling. And on the night of the 26th to the 27th of July 1942, he leads this raid against an airfield, Sidi Hanesh airfield in German-occupied Egypt. Amazing, they're travelling through the desert at night with no headlamps. And I've met one of these, well, I met an original SAS navigator, and he says it was like being on a ship at sea. They used the stars to get through the desert and arrive exactly where they wanted to be. In this case, this German airfield, and they're attacking both the German aircrew and the ground crew in their tents, but they're also destroying German aircraft. I think there's a Messerschmitt or 2 there. There were some transport aircraft as well, I think, on this airfield. Now, this might give you the impression that the SAS won the Second World War in North Africa by themselves. And I think it's slightly over-exaggerated, but it does give you a sense of just how potent these raids could be against targets that were just not expecting any enemy action. So they're like sitting ducks.
I don't add unarmed men to my tally.
This reasonably small unit, the SAS, was able to exert such a powerful effect on the mind of the Axis commanders that they were able to divert quite large numbers of troops and resources away from the front line there at El Alamein. After some pretty depressing retreats in early 1942, the British were able to stabilise that line at Alamein, reinforcements were rushed out, and General Montgomery was able to launch the Battle of El Alamein in October 1942. In that battle, the British-led forces smashed through Axis lines, destroyed many of their tanks, and sent Axis forces running back into Libya, retreating the way they'd come. The SAS would continue to play an eye-catching and useful role in North Africa, although Major Sterling was captured and spent the rest of the war in prisoner of war camps. Hitler launched a massive assault in the summer of 1942 into Ukraine and southern Russia, trying to get the raw materials, particularly the oil in the Caucasus. As part of that assault, German troops arrive at the industrial city of Stalingrad on the Volga. What follows is a months-long titanic struggle to seize that city. As you can see from this movie, you get a sense of the river Volga, and on the other side of the Volga, on the west bank of the Volga, you have Stalingrad. It's just under a pall of smoke. It is on fire, it's been destroyed. This movie shows reinforcements pouring across the Volga in these cobbled together craft. And we think this depicts one particular division, the 13th Division, being pushed across the river into the ruins of Stalingrad, try and cling on to those Soviet positions in the city centre. And this is a very dramatic depiction of it. I think the filmmakers have just gathered together every single bad thing that could possibly happen to a unit entering Stalingrad and just made it happen to Jude Law's unit, the 13th Division. You see German air attacks on the boats trying to cross the Volga. You see artillery shells landing. You see Soviet political commissars, Soviet officers shooting their own men if they tried to escape. That did happen in certain circumstances in World War II on the Eastern Front. Then you see those Soviet reinforcements pushing into the ruins of the city itself. The movie gives you a great impression of what did happen on the Eastern Front. Is units of untrained infantrymen being sent in, poorly equipped, with no operational understanding of the job they're expected to do or their objectives. This did happen in the Red Army in the Second World War.
Over here! Stretcher! The one with the rifles!
But that's one of the reasons that millions and millions of Soviet troops were killed in World War II. First of all, there was just the scale of the fighting, but secondly, the way in which the Red Army just threw human bodies into the front line, often without a really well-conceived plan.
one with the rifle gets killed! The one who is following picks up the rifle and shoots! The one with the rifle shoots! This way now! The one with the rifle follows him!
What I love about this scene is it gives you a really good sense of the strategic context, the geography of the Battle of Stalingrad. You have the big Volga River, you have Soviets trying to push reinforcements across into the city, which is on that west bank. It became such a tough fight, meant that both Hitler and Stalin did not want to put one step back. And so it sucks in lots of resources, sucks in lots of attention, until right by the end of 1942, the whole world is talking about this struggle in Stalingrad. Well, we're back in the Pacific now. We're charting the first big American offensive of the war. This is the Thin Red Line, and it follows the Battle of Guadalcanal, which is Guadalcanal is an island in the Solomon Islands. It's a chain of islands that stretches from in the South Pacific, from sort of Fiji up through the Solomons, up towards Papua New Guinea, up towards the Philippines. Guadalcanal was important because if the Americans could secure Guadalcanal, if they could secure the Solomon Islands, that would free up the sea routes to Australia, just allow the Americans to keep Australia supplied, just ensure that Australia wouldn't get cut off, isolated by the Japanese Empire.
Okay, we're gonna continue on up the hill to the right. Nobody fire. I'll throw the grenades till I get a signal. Okay, let's do it.
It's the first time the Americans really go on the offensive in the Pacific War. Since Pearl Harbor, they've been on the back foot. They win a striking success against a superior carry force at the Battle of Midway. But now, boom, they're going on the attack. They're going to work their way out through these islands. And first up, it's Guadalcanal. And this is an astonishing depiction of, it's an imagined hill battle. There's been quibbles with the landscape. It wasn't quite like this. This particular attack, it's not based on any one attack in particular. But I find it such a powerful example of a small unit attack in the Second World War. For me, this scene, although it's not based on any one particular action, it just sums up what would become the terrible, the hellish fighting the war in the Pacific. You get very, very highly motivated Japanese troops. For every American advance, for every American attack, they're throwing themselves in counterattack, well dug in positions. This is Guadalcanal, but it easily could apply to Iwo Jima, it could apply to Okinawa. It's just savage fighting, up close, personal, against a committed enemy in a brutal, unforgiving landscape. I wanted to include Bridge Over the River Kwai because it's one of the most famous World War II movies ever made. And it's a fictional story, but based around the building of the Burma Railway, this huge piece of Japanese imperial infrastructure designed to allow them to take supplies and troops up towards the Indian border, right up through Burma. Very, very difficult countryside, hugely challenging logistically to do this. And they used a lot of Allied prisoners of war, particularly troops that they'd captured in Singapore when it fell to the Japanese. I've talked to many survivors of the Burma Railway, and it was just a horrific experience. Tropical disease, Japanese brutality, construction work, very limited rations. Now, this is an interesting take on the Burma Railway story, because you've got Alec Guinness here playing a character, Colonel Nicholson, who gets his priorities a little bit wrong. He's so keen to show the Japanese just how tough and resourceful and impressive British soldiers can be, that he actually wants to build the bridge. He actually wants to show them, almost as an act of resistance, he tries to show them they can build the best bridge there can be. And too late, he realises that perhaps his duty should be, well, trying to sabotage that bridge, trying to make sure the Japanese don't complete this railway and open the route for an attack into British India. And so right at the end of the movie, you see this commando raid that's gone wrong. Alec Guinness faces a decision about whether or not to finally do the right thing and bring the bridge that he spent so much time building, to bring it down. In the end, Alec Guinness is terribly wounded by that mortar round, and he falls on the plunger. He detonates the explosive on the bridge. Does he intend to or not? We don't know. It's left ambiguous. But bridges on this railway, like this bridge here, they were eventually destroyed, but not by commando raids. They were destroyed by massive Allied air attacks. So that railway never really served the purpose that the Japanese had hoped it might. There was no bridge over the Vakwai, this is fictional, but there were bridges over rivers in Burma built by Allied POWs in late 1942 and into 1943, and they were in operation for a year or two before they were destroyed, not by commando raids, but by Allied bombing later in the war. Well, we're heading back to Stalingrad now, because that battle has been raging from September of 1942, but it has reached its terrible finale in January, February 1943. And that brings us neatly onto the next movie, which is actually called Stalingrad. And this shows the tail end of the battle, a very, very different scene here, very different geography. Because what happens is, as that battle is being fought in the city itself, the Soviets build up huge reserves around the edge of the city, on the flanks of the city, in the open countryside around the city. And as the German attention is focused on the city, the Soviets launch a massive counterattack. With the onset of winter at the end of 1942, they launch a massive counterattack, 2 pincers that surround Stalingrad and cut it off from the rest of the German army. So you have Axis forces in the city of Stalingrad itself, still engaged in a battle for the city, but now they've been surrounded and the countryside around them is controlled by the Soviets. Now the Axis are trapped in the city and they're being attacked constantly by Soviet troops advancing across the frozen steppe from all around. In this scene you see the T-34 tanks, you see infantry, and you see desperate Axis German defenders using any weapon that comes to hand to try and protect themselves, because it's now an encirclement battle and that entire Axis force faces annihilation. That's what's so fascinating about Stalingrad. It begins with this great German advance through southern Russia. It seems like the Germans are going to take this city with Stalin's name. It's all quite triumphant. and it turns into a bloodbath, and eventually it swings completely the other way. It's the Soviets who have the upper hand, the Soviets who have the equipment, they have the numbers, and they are just pounding this much reduced Axis force to the point of destruction. This was a practical victory. It did help to change the balance of power on the Eastern Front, but more than that, it was a moral victory. It became clear now the Soviets were able to go toe-to-toe with the Germans and defeat them. The days of massive Soviet retreats were over. After Stalingrad, well, there are no big German wins on the Eastern Front. They might enjoy some local success in some places, but the story from Stalingrad is one of inexorable Soviet advance from this city, from the Volga River, all the way eventually to Berlin. Over 2 years of some of the most intense and some of those massive fighting in human history. This was the turning of the tide. We're back in North Africa now, February 1943, following the success of the British and their allies at the Battle of El Alamein in Egypt. They're advancing along the coast of North Africa, through Libya towards Tunisia. But there's an American-led force that's landed in northwest Africa, places like Algeria and Morocco, and they are now pushing also towards Tunisia. So the Axis forces, now commanded by Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, are being squeezed in the middle, in and around Tunisia. And at the Battle of the Kasserine Pass, the Germans and the Americans will meet each other on the battlefield for the first time. The overall commander of those American troops is General Patton. He's not actually present at the Kasserine Pass. He doesn't actually watch the fighting here. There's a couple of other inaccuracies. Those tanks look very wrong. They look like post-war tanks, M47s, M48s, so I don't know what they're doing here. It is a depiction of the fighting that goes on as Rommel and the Germans try and counterattack. They try and strike out of their base in Tunisia, really to stop the Allies coming in from east and west, just trapping them in a vice. They do enjoy a little tactical success, but ultimately they're outnumbered, massively outgunned in North Africa. And in May 1943, only a few months after this, the final Axis troops in Tunisia, in Tunis itself, they will surrender to the Allies. North Africa, the North African campaign will be over. It's time for the Allies to turn their attention to Europe. This is one of the most harrowing, one of the most epic, spectacular scenes in all World War II movie history. You get Oskar Schindler in the movie Schindler's List. He's watching an event that did happen, the clearance of the Jewish ghetto in Krakow. It took place in March 1943. For 2 days in March, the 13th and the 14th, the Germans cleared the ghetto. That means they just emptied it. They moved any Jews that were able to work to concentration camps, and any Jews that were too old, too frail, too sick, they were executed on the spot. The entire Jewish neighborhood was just depopulated, cleared out. What's so striking about the scene is you see Jewish people being killed. And this is an important period of the Holocaust. It's called the Holocaust of Bullets. It's before the gas chambers are up and running, before the industrial slaughter of Jewish people. They were beaten and they were clubbed and they were shot. And that required enormous manpower. What you're looking at here is what the Germans thought was actually very, well, an inefficient way of killing Jews, and also a way of killing Jews that was detrimental to the mental health of the Germans that were doing it, because you were looking in the eyes of someone as you were killing them, stabbing them. And what you see in the months and years that follow is an industrial process which can kill far greater number of Jews and has less of an impact on the perpetrators.
Das wollen wir heute noch schaffen? Nee, das schaffen wir nicht.
Many Jews had known this day would come, and so Jews tried to hide in place. They built secret chambers in their houses to hope that they would be able to outlast the clearances. But as you can see here, the thoroughness with which the Germans are approaching this operation. And one of the Holocaust survivors who was advising on the movie, when she met Ralph Fiennes, she was deeply traumatized. She was taken back there because she said his acting was so good that he had become Goethe. It's April 1943. That North African campaign is in its last few days and weeks. It's clear that the Allies are next going to push across the Mediterranean and begin the liberation of Europe. But where are they going to go? Are they going to go to Greece? Are they going to go to Italy? Are they going to go to Sardinia, southern France? And this is when the British come up with one of the greatest intelligence coups, one of the greatest intelligence operations of all time. It's called Operation Mincemeat. And this is the movie that tries to stay, well, pretty true to that remarkable story. The British go to enormous efforts to make sure the Germans believe that the attack will fall on Sardinia and a Greek island. How do they do this? Well, they put those secret plans in a briefcase. They attach that briefcase to the wrist of a dead body. They push that dead body out of a submarine in the Mediterranean and ensure that it washes ashore on the Spanish coast. They know that the Spanish, they're not formal allies, they're not part of the Axis, but they are friendly towards Hitler, and they know that the Spanish will pass on the contents of that briefcase to the Germans. This scene shows the start of that phase of the operation. The dead body is washed ashore on this beautiful Spanish coast, loaded on the back of this donkey cart on its way to the Spanish authorities. But the key thing is to make the Spanish and then the Germans believe that it's true, that it's not a hoax.
But in the conventional war, the wheels of combat turn, the forces of men and machines swell until suddenly the die is cast.
Hitler's still reinforcing Sicily. That can only mean the other pieces of our deception plan.
I've missed the mark. But Major Martin has washed ashore. Gomez Bear has been called by the Spanish police. Our plan proceeds.
The fate of the free world dependent on a corpse in a donkey cart.
One of the great challenges for the British was to find a body that could plausibly look like this staff officer who had these secret plans. And sadly, they found a homeless man who died from eating rat poison in King's Cross in London. He died in hospital. And the Secret Services were alerted because they were on the lookout for a young man that could play this part. And his body was refrigerated until it was ready to go. Then they set about building his backstory. They filled his wallet with a picture of a girlfriend who was a real person, letters, a receipt from a hotel, I think, a bed and breakfast stay in North Wales. They worked out exactly what the ocean currents would do, so when and where they had to release him, in order to deliver him to this beach in this particular part of Spain, where it was known that the Spanish authorities were particularly friendly with the Germans. It was a brilliantly conceived and executed operation. And involved was one Ian Fleming, who would go on to write James Bond novels after the war. This was part of his experience of working in intelligence during the Second World War.
British Admiralty on the phone, sir.
The Germans have bugged the phones there, so any message we pass to the embassy is essentially a message to Berlin.
Oh, they asked that you use the unsecured line.
Ainsworth?
Captain, is your line secure?
Of course.
Good, because we've just received news that one of our own may have washed up in Huelva.
Carrying top-secret documents, General Nye's camp is very anxious to recover.
I'll begin inquiries right away.
And of course, the fact that we're looking for papers at all must remain classified.
Understood.
They're sending messages out to their people in Spain going, you've got to get that briefcase. And they're making sure the Spanish and then the Germans are going to be able to read those messages. It's all about persuading the Germans that this is a disaster for the British because their plans for the upcoming operation have fallen into enemy hands. It's such a popular story, this, it's always talked about, but there's a bit of mythology that's been made around it as well. Some people think it actually took place as part of the D-Day deception campaign. We'll come on to D-Day later on, but there were numerous deceptions used against the Germans on D-Day to try and persuade them the landings would be elsewhere. But this is not one of them. This was definitely 1943, before the invasion of Sicily. This deception did work on the Germans. It was a huge success. They sent reinforcements elsewhere, but not to Sicily.
Captain, I still can't see a thing!
Bombardier, how does that target look?
Target's still covered, Captain. What do you want me to do? Captain, do you read me? Yes, I read you. Captain, my sight says I'm over the target. I've got to do something. Now, what do you want me to do?
That's it.
That's it. That's it. Bombs away.
It's May 1943 and World War II has really moved to the skies above Europe. It really is another front in the war against Hitler's Germany. The Americans and the British are launching massive, massive air raids against Germany's infrastructure, particularly its weapons production, its aircraft production, tank production, all that kind of thing. Now this features the Memphis Belle B-17 bomber. The movie's called Memphis Belle. Memphis Belle was a real B-17. It did complete its tour of 25 missions in May 1943, and that meant the crew they didn't have to go again. They could sign up again if they wanted, but they didn't have to go again, which was good because flying in these bombers above Germany, particularly on the daytime raids, was extraordinarily dangerous, one of the most dangerous things you could do in World War II. These bombers were slow-moving, they're heavy bombers, moving over well-defended German armaments factories and towns and cities. There was anti-aircraft fire, but there was also German fighters swarming around the skies that would pick off these bombers as they went to and from the target. So it's very dangerous, these bomber crews. And this movie just gives you a great sense of the feel and the energy and the sights and the sounds of a bomber raid. The B-17 heavy bomber had 10 aircrew on board, and that's why this movie really gives you a sense of the camaraderie. You would have got to know each other really well. Every day you went out on these missions, you faced death together. And interestingly, when they showed this movie to surviving aircrew surviving bomber crew, veterans, they said on the whole there were inaccuracies, of course, but they liked it. They thought it gave you a good sense of what it was like to go on these raids. But they did say the only thing disagreed was how much bickering there was on board. The closeness of these crews, they became like brothers on these tours. The B-17 was a real workhorse of the American effort in World War II. It was a pre-war heavy bomber, and much bigger aircraft were introduced as the war went on, but something like 40% of the bombs dropped on Germany in World War II were dropped from these B-17s. And indeed, they include real footage of bombs dropping from the war in this movie, which I think is very, very powerful. By this point in 1943, and stretching now for the next few months of the war, Germany was just battered from above. Its cities were systematically laid waste. Its factories were destroyed. Armament production was moved underground. It was dispersed to all sorts of different areas. It was an enormous challenge for the German government to keep the war machine on the rails. And these air attacks would only intensify as the war went on, reaching a fever pitch in 1945.
Hello, all cooler aircraft. I'm going into attack. Stand by to come in your order when I tell you.
Whilst gigantic fleets of Allied bombers were heading across occupied Europe to smash entire suburbs and factory districts of towns and cities, one attack took place in May 1943 that was completely different. It was a precision strike carried out by bombers to try and land bombs on a very, very precise, very small target, and that was the great dams of the Ruhr in Germany. The Ruhr was the industrial region. A lot of the energy for the armaments factories came from big hydroelectric dams, and lots of the water for those factories as well came from those dams. And it was thought by the British that if they could target those dams exactly and destroy them, well, then it might have a massive impact on the ability of the Germans to make war.
Hello, M for Mother. Stand by to take over if anything happens. Okay, leader. Good luck.
The problem was they just didn't have precision munitions in those days. They didn't have laser-guided bombs. They had dumb bombs that were dropped from high up in the air. And so in an extraordinarily innovative, unusual, first of its kind attack, the British came up with the idea of the Dam Busters raid. And that involved using these giant bombers, Lancaster bombers, at very low level, with special bombs that had never been used before in combat, that were designed to be released, would skim off, bounce off the surface of the reservoir, hit the wall of the dam, sink down and blow up at exactly the right point.
Steady. 240. Steady. Hold it, steady. 235. Hold it. 240. Hold it. 235. That's 5. 235. Long gun.
They had to be at exactly the right height, travelling at exactly the right speed, and drop the bomb at exactly the right moment if it was all going to work. It is certainly one of the most formidable aviation challenges of World War II.
Nice work. Nice work, Skipper. Bang on, Skipper.
It was a demonstration of what air power was capable of when bombs can be delivered with extreme precision on very, very high value targets. The Dam Busters raid was the start of, well, modern strategic bombing.
Why are we always sent out? It's the only damn squad in the whole U.S. Army?
Yeah, where's the rest of the army?
There ain't patrol.
It's July 1943 and the Allies for the first time have invaded an Axis country, a member of the Axis alliance. A classic PR flex that you always see in dictatorships, big pictures of the glorious leader everywhere and flags waving. But now that propaganda sign absolutely riddled with bullet holes. The Allies are advancing through Sicily, Italy, mainland Italy's on the horizon, and Mussolini doesn't have long left as the man ruling Italy.
You know how you smoke out a sniper? You send a guy out in the open and you see if he gets shot. They thought that one up at West Point.
You get such a powerful sense this scene of the potency of snipers in these urban landscapes that can be so well protected. They could be anywhere, but you have to flush, you have to move through if you're an advancing unit. You can't just wait for the backup. And infantry had to move through these streets. And as they say, the way to flush out sniper is to wait for them to show themselves, wait for them to fire a shot. And the best way to do that is to expose yourself to their shots. Terrifying. The Sicilian and the Italian campaign that followed are often the forgotten campaigns of the war in Europe. But they were savage. The landscape, the geography, the urban environment ensured that there were many, many encounters, many battles like this as troops pushed through Sicily, pushed up the Italian peninsula, and had to fight in some very, very savage urban settings, where, as you're seeing here, it was very close quarters.
Had them in the sights all the time.
All the time.
As a result of the fighting in Sicily, right at the end of July 1943, Mussolini's fascist colleagues, the government, turn against him. They kick him out and the king places him under arrest. About a month after that, in very early September 1943, Allied troops land in Italy proper, and the Italian government attempts to change sides, attempts to leave the Germans and join the Allies. At that point, the Germans invade Italy. They push their troops right down Italy. And for the next year and a half, really, till the end of the war, the Allies and the Germans will be locked in a savage attritional battle as the Allies slowly push up the length of the Italian peninsula. We've arrived in late 1943. Really, this movie, Cross of Iron, is just a snapshot. It could be anywhere on the Eastern Front. And what you're seeing in this movie is just the blows being rained down on the German army on the Eastern Front. A year is a long time in World War II. And in the fall, the autumn of 1942, the Germans were still arguably dominant on the Eastern Front, albeit slowing down. By the fall of 1943, going into the winter of 43-44, the Germans just taking an astonishing beating. They're just retreating and retreating and retreating. Now, because the German army is a highly effective fighting force, they are making the Soviets pay in blood for every meter they advance. But it's just a grim, inevitable backwards journey for the Germans. Great images of T-34 tanks crushing barbed wire. You see how versatile these vehicles are. Huge, big, steel-plated beasts moving across a broken-up battlefield, crushing barbed wire, going over these ramparts, these defensive features that have been built across ditches. You wouldn't have wanted to face them.
Onto the back! Get everything! Fire!
The Soviets now are coming forward. They've got overwhelming numbers of men, but they've also got vast numbers of tanks. They're producing these T-34 tanks you see here. These are actual T-34s. They were rented from the Yugoslav army, which had plenty of them after World War II. And these soldiers are also, many of the soldiers, the extras, are from the Yugoslav army as well. And these T-34s were being produced in unimaginable numbers by the Soviet Union. The Soviets made 15,500 T-34s in 1943 alone. That's nearly 50 every single day. That's more than all of the tanks of all different varieties that the Germans were producing that year, 1943. The scales are just now heavily, heavily tipped against the Germans. lots of extras here. These are 1,000 Yugoslav soldiers that were provided for this movie. It was a very, very challenging movie to produce. They ran out of money, they all fell out with each other. It was just very, very hectic indeed. But actually it stood the test of time. I think it's now regarded as one of the best depictions of the German army as we're entering the later stages of the war. Some of the friction that exists between German troops, the convinced Nazis, the old aristocratic cadre, the grizzled veterans. It's a very interesting snapshot of an army that's being brought under unimaginable pressure. And throughout the second half of 1943 and into 1944, the Germans keep trying to build these defensive lines. They think they're going to be able to defend. That Hitler is convinced we'll be able to hold the Soviets and we'll be able to rebuild the German war economy and develop wonder weapons that will allow us to go on the offensive again. But each time, whether it's on the Dnieper River or any of these other places, the Soviets just don't give them chance to bed in. They throw their forces forward. They're profligate with their soldiers. They lose vast numbers of casualties, they lose vast numbers of tanks, but they don't care. Stalin wants to keep up the momentum. He wants to keep punching, keep pushing, keep the Germans on the back foot, stop them from salvaging something from the nightmare that the Eastern Front is rapidly becoming.
Really, I can't wait till it's over. I must get out. Danny!
By March 1944, there were German prisoner of war camps absolutely stuffed with airmen. Thanks to the huge Allied bombing campaigns and some of those aircraft being shot down, those crews, if they survived, they parachuted out, managed to survive. They were taken to big camps like this one, Stalag Luft 3. This is where this movie is set, The Great Escape. And it is a depiction of a very ambitious escape attempt that was made.
Danny, what's the matter? Danny, come here. Roger.
Many of the airmen believed it was their duty to try and do what they could, even though they were prisoners of war, to interrupt the German war effort. And that meant making multiple escape attempts. Because the more they tried to escape, the more the Germans would have to put resources into keeping them secure in these locations. That meant more troops, more barbed wire, more machine guns that weren't able to be used on the front line. So each camp had someone who was in charge of trying to organise escapes. In the case of Stalag Luft 3, that man was Roger Bushell, codename Big X. This is a great scene. This shows the final escape attempt being made. They had decided they were going to dig not one, not two, but 3 tunnels out of this camp, through the huts in which the prisoners lived, under the compound and out on the other side of the barbed wire, into the countryside beyond.
All right. Hold on to yourself, Bartlett. You're 20 feet short.
What do you mean, 20 feet short?
You're 20 feet short of the woods. The hole is right here in the open. The guard is between us and the lights.
How could that happen? The survey took us miles. What difference does it make it's happened?
They actually dug 3 tunnels out, Tom, Dick and Harry. One of them was discovered by the Germans and it was destroyed. Another was deemed unsuitable, so they used it for storage. This tunnel, Harry, was undiscovered. It had taken months to dig. 80 tons of sand had to be removed. They had to build all sorts of pit props and a primitive little railway system to take the sand out of the excavation works. That night, on the 24th to the 25th of March 1944, 76 officers made their escape. I've actually interviewed someone who was in the queue in the tunnel waiting to escape, and he realised that the alarm had been sounded. He had to turn around, scuttle back into the accommodation block, and that was the end of their effort. It turns out that was a blessing in disguise, because of those officers that escaped, only 3 made it to safety. They made it to neutral Allied countries. The rest of them were recaptured, and 50 of them, contrary to the rules of war, were executed by the Gestapo on Hitler's orders.
Bitte in Werkhalle 1 melden. Gruppe 2, gelbe Karten, erhalten Anweisungen direkt von der Aufsicht. Gruppe 2, gelbe Karten, erhalten Anweisungen direkt von der Aufsicht. Immer bei der Gruppe bleiben und nicht den Arbeitsplatz verlassen.
As things got more desperate for the Third Reich, Adolf Hitler turned to kind of Hail Mary strategies, desperate gambles. And he particularly believed that Germany could still win the war if they embraced, if they developed wonder weapons. These were rockets, these were ballistic missiles, these were things he thought may just turn the strategic balance. And this movie is called Operation Crossbow, which is the name of an Allied operation trying to identify what these wonder weapons were, particularly at the site of Peenemünde in northern Germany. This movie has secret agents entering some of these underground facilities to check out the Germans' weapons programs themselves. That didn't really happen, but it's quite exciting.
Triebwerk klar.
Sauerstoff.
Fertig machen zum Zünden.
Mit dieser Rakete wird es möglich sein, eine Sprengladung mitten in New York hineinplatzen zu lassen.
As they're entering this rocket facility, you can see it's burrowed deep into the earth, and that is true. By this stage of the war, by 1944, unless the Germans were burying their industry, it was vulnerable to being smashed from the air. So the most sensitive programs, the most important programs by this stage, were being burrowed deep into the earth. If you go to Silesia today, which is now part of Poland, it was part of Germany, you can see hundreds and hundreds of meters of tunnels that were burrowed out for the purpose of making weapons factories. In this scene here, our secret agent is being shown a very futuristic rocket the Germans are working on. It says that it will be able to carry power a rocket of 100 tons, and it will be able to hit New York. So this is the stuff of the Cold War, this is stuff of intercontinental ballistic missiles. In fact, the Germans did develop a V2 rocket, which weighed about 12 tons in the war. It was used towards the end of the war. It was the first man-made object to enter space. So it was fired vertically, it went up through the atmosphere and then came down on targets. But its range was around 200 miles. So they were shot from the coast of Belgium, for example, or Holland, and they were able to strike targets in southern England. Thousands of these V1s were sent to strike across southern England. Luckily for the British, they were slow enough that anti-aircraft defences could work against them. You could fly up next to them and shoot them down. If you're an interceptor, you could try and hit them with anti-aircraft fire. The V2 was supersonic. It was a rocket. There was very little you could do. After it launched, there was very little you could do to stop it. And they inflicted terrible damage on London through the second half of 1944 and into 1945. Despite the fear and the damage and the casualties these V weapons caused, they didn't come anywhere near to Hitler's dreams of knocking Britain out of the war, or fracturing the Western Alliance, or forcing Britain to make peace. It was a gigantic drain on the resources of the Third Reich. Money and expertise and materials that could have been put into building tanks and aircraft that went into Hitler's fantasy wonder weapons. All right, folks, we've arrived on the 6th of June 1944, the day of days, D-Day, and we're looking at the opening sequence here of Saving Private Ryan, one of the most extraordinary bits of cinema ever produced. What you're seeing here is the Allied invasion of Northwest Europe. The Soviets are pressing in from the east. The Allies are still advancing slowly up the Italian peninsula, but now it's time to take the fight to the Germans in northern France. It's time to land in Northwest Europe and try and blast their way to Berlin, get this war ended. This day is one of the huge milestones in the Second World War. You've got American troops landing. They're landing on Utah and Omaha Beach. You have Canadian troops landing on Juno Beach. You've got British troops landing on Gold and Sword beaches. D-Day was a gamble. Winston Churchill got very nervous about it. He said to his wife, as he went to bed that night, he said, "Do you realise that by tomorrow morning, tens of thousands of young men could have been killed?" In fact, the landings were a huge success. The amount of preparation that got into them, the amount of air power, the amount of naval power, the amount of special equipment that had been evolved to use on these battlefields, it ensured that in the space of this day, despite ferocious resistance in those first hours at Omaha, in the space of this day, something like 150,000 Allies were able to land in France and establish a toehold in Nazi-occupied Northwest Europe. So the Germans are entrenched in their so-called Atlantic Wall, bunkers, artillery positions, machine gun positions. On this high ground, they've got very good visibility of anything landing on the beach. And by bad luck as well, there'd been an exercise that night, so the German defenders were at their post. They were ready for an assault, even though they didn't really know that one was coming. Historians like to nitpick this sequence, but I've talked to many veterans, including veterans of Omaha, and I've asked them, what was it like that day? And they say, often they start out by saying, well, go and watch Saving Private Ryan, and we'll talk after that. So for them, I think Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks, they really managed to capture the essence of what it was like on Omaha that day. A landing when really nearly everything that could go wrong did go wrong. The hope was that a combination of a massive aerial assault on the very early morning of D-Day and the big ships out to sea firing their big guns, that combination, the hope was, would have destroyed really all the resistance to the troops landing on the beach. But that wasn't the case. The Allied bombing had largely missed their targets. Many of the bombs had landed in the fields beyond. And the big ships firing out to sea, they'd helped, but they hadn't suppressed all of the German defence positions by any means. You can see there the big concrete positions on the high ground, offering the Germans excellent defence whilst giving them a good field of fire on the arriving American troops below. Steven Spielberg went to great lengths to try and ensure accuracy in this scene. The equipment, the men were put through training as they would have been in 1944, and the sound effects are as real as they could get. The sound effects, they fired wartime weapons to try and record those sounds. You also get something like in the scene, which is the leadership required to get off that beach. A lot of men were discombobulated. They'd suffered astonishing casualties. The officers and sergeants had been killed. And it came down to a few people saying to groups of men, we are going to die if we stay on this beach. We have to get off the beach. Finding weak points in those German defences, finding cracks, moving up, as Tom Hanks does, through the German defences. And once the Allies manage to push through, they find those cracks, then the Germans are in big trouble because they become surrounded. Those bunkers become targets. You can use flamethrowers and grenades to clear out the defenders. And that's what happens through the day on D-Day on Omaha Beach. We think something like 10,000 Allies were killed on D-Day, far, far less than the number that planners had been worried about. But of those, 2, 3, 4, maybe even 5,000 were killed right here on Omaha Beach.
Get that man spread out!
Just a few days after D-Day on the other side of the world, the Americans launched another big amphibious assault, this time on the island of Saipan in the Pacific. It's a very strategically placed island in the Mariana chain of islands. And if the Americans could occupy it, they could use its airfields for heavy bombers to strike at targets right the way across the theatre, from the Philippines all the way up, for the first time, to the major cities of Japan. You see the Japanese had plenty of time to prepare defences. They've got entrenched infantry positions at the top of these hills, these very, very mountainous volcanic islands. Plenty of opportunity for the defenders really to use the landscape against the attacking forces.
How am I doing?
You're good now, you're good.
Interesting here, you see a so-called banzai charge. There are examples throughout the Pacific War when the Japanese felt their position to be hopeless. They wanted to die with honour, they wanted to attack, effectively commit suicide. And so you see the Japanese defenders on this ridge, at the urgings of an officer, just charge down in a suicidal banzai attack that would be torn apart by the machine guns, the rifles and the bayonets of the Americans waiting below.
Let's go! Stay on my ass!
You see Nicolas Cage there, who's a junior American officer, and he tells someone to stay with him, stick really close to him. And that's because that is a member of the Navajo Nation, a First Nations at the time that had been described as American Indians. And they spoke a language that was so unknown outside the Navajo Nation that they were used as communications specialists, signalers, in these campaigns, because they were able to talk to each other on wireless radio sets, unencrypted, and they knew the Japanese would not be able to know what they were talking about. It would be an impossible, effectively their language was an impossible code to break. The Japanese had trained to learn English, obviously, but also other languages. But when Navajo came along, they had no idea. And that meant that you could communicate quickly without having to go through the trouble of encoding stuff and decoding at the other end. So these Navajo signalers were absolutely essential. And they were known as wind talkers, which gives us the name of the movie. It's interesting, you see here that hatch opening in the ground. And that was a feature of all of these island campaigns, these island battles. The Japanese had a lot of time to prepare these island defences. They realised they're going to be outgunned. They couldn't compete in terms of tanks and aircraft and heavy artillery. But what they could do was just fight in as smart a way as possible to absolutely maximise all their advantages. And that involved digging tunnels deep under their positions and staying quiet until American troops had passed over, and then emerging from those tunnels to cause mayhem behind the advancing American troops. And so you see it in this movie, you'll see it in other movies. This was a classic tactic. scene just really shows Nicolas Cage just wrapped up in a red mist of hatred, of battle lust. And it does seem that these campaigns, these island campaigns, did exact a pretty terrific mental toll, particularly on the Marines, the men who fought through island after island against these fanatical, suicidal defenders.
Since the Red Army first attacked nearly a month ago, our troops have already been pushed back to the Polish border.
Conference hut.
This, compounded with the loss of the 4th Army in Minsk, threatens the entire eastern perimeter.
Yes, sir.
Consider pulling men from Army Group North Ukraine, as well as the Romanian, in order to defend this line with the maximum force and prevent.
We come to the 20th of July, and we're going to look at an absolutely critical moment in the history of the war, perhaps even the history of the world. An attempt by Hitler's own military officers to take his life, to assassinate him. D-Day is about a month and a bit old. The Eastern Front is collapsing as the Soviets launch monstrous attacks on German positions. Rome has fallen to the Allies. The situation for the Third Reich is terrible. It is clear that they cannot win this war. It is clear that there will be no attempt to negotiate a peace with the Allies whilst Adolf Hitler lives. So a group of German officers come together to plot the murder and the downfall, not just of Hitler and senior Nazis, but of the whole Nazi regime. At their centre is a man called Klaus von Stauffenberg. He's portrayed here by Tom Cruise. The movie takes its name from their secret operation, Valkyrie.
He says it's urgent. Yes, General. This is Stauffenberg.
Russian air activity has proven just as impregnable as their ground force. My Führer.
We're going to look at this scene here where Hitler is receiving a briefing. He's got a planning meeting. He's looking at maps. He's being told basically how badly the war's going. He's in a hut at the so-called Wolf's Lair, which was his headquarters in northern Poland. Stauffenberg's close to Hitler. He's one of his staff officers. He places an attaché case. He placed that briefcase full of explosives quite close to Hitler. Stauffenberg then finds an excuse to leave the room, and the trap is sprung.
In some areas, they outnumber us. If we can afford to give ground along the Italian front, I further One thing is certain. The Red Army will continue an aggressive push west, even at the expense...
You see the critical moment there. It was all an accident. The bag of explosives that Stauffenberg leaves in that room, it gets in the way of someone, it hits someone on the leg, and he just picks it up and moves it behind a solid oak table leg away, tragically, from Adolf Hitler.
In order to rebuild at this...
One thing I like about this movie is you see Adolf Hitler himself, you see his descent into physical and mental collapse. Even before this assassination attempt, he's leant over the map, he looks weak, he's got low energy, he's being crushed by his responsibilities. At 12:45 p.m, the bomb goes off, and it's a success. It does enormous damage, it destroys the table, it destroys much of the room, it kills 3 officers present and 1 secretary, but it does not kill Adolf Hitler. He is protected from the blast by that table leg, the pure luck of someone just moving that briefcase. His trousers are tattered, there are wounds, he's perforated an eardrum, so he is injured, but he's not dead.
As you are.
You then see Stauffenberg leaving Hitler's headquarters here because this is just a small part of a much larger plan. Stauffenberg wants to get back to Berlin. He wants to take out all of the senior Nazis and indeed topple the regime. This isn't just about killing Hitler. Eventually, Hitler gets on the telephone, he convinces people he's still alive. It puts a bit of spine into his supporters, and the plot fails. This has numerous consequences. One of them is that Hitler organises a purge of his own armed forces. Many effective commanders, people like Field Marshal Rommel, are caught up in this and they're executed or forced to commit suicide. Stauffenberg is executed. But perhaps the most important effect is on Hitler himself. He's already suffering before the assassination attempt. He gets addicted to drugs as part of his medical recovery from his injuries. His trust and faith in his subordinates breaks down. He becomes paranoid. He really does descend into full mental and physical collapse in the months that follow. We're in August 1944, just days after the assassination attempt on Hitler, and the fighting has moved to Warsaw. Throughout the summer of 1944, the Red Army, the Soviets, have made enormous advances across Eastern Europe. But the Polish government that was in exile in London did not want Poland to be liberated by the Soviet Union, because they knew that Stalin would conquer, they would annex the Soviet Union, and you just end up swapping Nazi rule for Soviet rule. And so in August 1944, the Polish government took a huge gamble. They organised a massive uprising in the Polish capital, Warsaw, so that they could seize control of the government. They could say to the Soviets, no thanks, you don't need to come in here, we've already got rid of the Germans. It began with a series of strikes across the city. They weren't as well coordinated as they could have been, and the Germans were able to cling on despite some early setbacks. In this movie, The Pianist, I think you see one of the opening stages of the Warsaw Uprising, when this German headquarters building is attacked by rocket grenade, and then German soldiers and workers and even a nurse come out of the building, and they are mown down by rifle and machine gun fire. And that would have been the case right across Warsaw. They attacked key buildings, police and radio broadcast buildings, things like that. And what followed was weeks of savage fighting. The Soviets were quite close to the city of Warsaw. They could have come in and intervened, but Stalin stopped the Soviet advance on the outskirts of the city to let the Germans and Poles fight each other to death. As for the Germans, they were determined to crush this uprising. The Nazis hated the Poles, they hated Poland, and even if they were going to lose this war, they wanted to eradicate the Polish people, Polish culture, and the Polish capital city from the map. In this clip here, you see why the Germans were so hard to fight. They bring heavy armour into the streets of Warsaw. This tank blows a hole in a neighbouring apartment. And it's that kind of discrepancy between the weapons that the Polish had access to and the heavy artillery and the tanks that the Germans had that made this, in the end, sadly, a one-sided contest. much of Warsaw was laid waste. More than 15,000 members of the Polish resistance army were killed, men and women who'd been training underground for this event, for this uprising, and perhaps another 6,000 wounded. It was a devastating, all-out clash for the Polish capital. I like the movie Kelly's Heroes. I used to watch it with my dad when I was a kid. It is fantasy. It is based on no true story. We're putting it in here in the second half of 1944 because, roughly speaking, it talks about American troops as they're liberating France. In the case of Kelly's Heroes, Clint Eastwood leads a bunch of his buddies on a private heist to try and steal some Nazi gold. But it is a movie that reflects the sense of possibility that followed D-Day and the savage fighting in Normandy that lasted for about a month after D-Day. The German army in the West had collapsed. US and Allied troops had spread out across northern France. By the late summer, the 19th of August, Allied troops had liberated Paris. It looked, possibly, in that golden summer, like the war could be over by Christmas. It wasn't to be, but that's the period that gives us the story that is Kelly's Heroes. It's also a special movie for me because I have been on a couple of expeditions looking for Nazi gold. There's something about Nazi gold and the rumours of it in bank vaults, in caves, in tunnels that has inspired people ever since the Second World War. I looked for it in a railway tunnel in modern-day Poland. It wasn't there. What's next?
Ja, ich bin hier, Matthias. Fantastisch. Einmal solches Material zu meiner Verfügung.
Following the liberation of Paris and much of France, the Allies thought they might be pushing an open door. They thought, well, perhaps the German army in the West is finished. And so the Allies planned a very, very ambitious operation to jump in one go across the various rivers that make up the Rhine River system. That would allow the Allied troops, with plenty of time to go before the end of the year, to dash across the North German plain and seize Berlin. It was a time of high optimism in September 1944. They launched this gamble, this operation called Market Garden. But they need to cross a lot of rivers, they need to seize a lot of bridges intact. And the final bridge was at Arnhem. It was, as they say, a bridge too far. And that is the name of the famous movie about those events that does its best to stick as close as it can to the historical record. So airborne troops would land in gliders, they'd land in parachutes, right the way along this long corridor, seizing all of these bridges across various rivers and canals. This is one of those landings taken place, and you've got a bunch of C-47 aircraft, Douglas aircraft, they were called in Britain Dakotas. They are the backbone of the Allied lift capability, the backbone of our transport aircraft and aircraft that paratroopers can jump out of. And this scene, it really does look like archive footage that was captured around this time. Something like 35,000 airborne troops deployed during Operation Market Garden. That's a lot more than were deployed on D-Day. It was a joint operation, predominantly Americans and Brits taking part. The British paratroopers were given the toughest assignment, that is seizing the bridge at Arnhem, so the furthest away from Allied lines. But there were British and American troops right the way along this corridor. That was Operation Market, the airborne landings to seize all these key bridges, seize that road that led them all the way basically into the back door of Germany. Then Operation Garden would kick in, which was the armoured assault. Right, now the movie switches to the action at the start of Operation Garden. So this is the Allied front line. This is as far as they've got. They've massed lots of armour here. This is a Guards tank division. They're going to be tip of the spear. They're going to blast their way up this road to relieve all of the airborne units that have taken control of possessions up the road. The problem is you're advancing deep into German territory up a very narrow band, which is being held by airborne forces. First of all, the first job for the Allies, first job for Operation Garden, is to smash through the German front line so it can reach those airborne troops beyond. And that is a job for Michael Caine. It's a classic 1944 advance. You've got big 25-pound field guns, the workhorse of the British Army. They're firing shells, they're preparing the ground, they're trying to saturate the ground into which the tanks will be attacking. And when that bombardment lifts, you get Sherman tanks rolling forward, looking to punch a hole through whatever German defences are left. Interesting, you don't usually see this on camera. The Allies are shooting a creeping barrage. So they're putting a curtain of shrapnel and explosives and smoke down just in front of their own advancing troops. So the idea is that you clear the way with these artillery shells that land, clear people out, terrify people, force them to go underground, and then your armour, your infantry are right behind that screen. It's a tactic that was developed during the First World War, and they're using it right here.
Abwarten.
So right from the off, the British units leading this assault, they discover much stiffer opposition they've been hoping for. And that threw the timeline, threw the whole timetable for Operation Market Garden off. Because those units of paratroopers that have seized those bridges and key points along this route, well, they can't hold out for ages. They've only got what they brought with them, bullets, food. They need resupply. They need support coming up from the south with these tanks. But if the tanks are getting bogged down, if they're having to fight savage battles like this, then they're going to be too late. They're going to be too late to resupply, to relieve all of these isolated units. And that's what happens in Operation Market Garden. They do manage to make it nearly all the way across every branch of the River Rhine, except that one last bridge, the bridge at Arnhem. It proved to be a bridge too far.
Tell him to go to hell.
We haven't the proper facilities to take you all prisoner. Sorry. What? We'd like to, but we can't accept your surrender. Was there anything else?
Eventually, as we see in this clip, the Germans talk about the British surrender and the British make this gag. Now, Anthony Hopkins is playing Colonel John Frost, who led this unit at the bridge. Colonel Frost was actually an advisor on this movie. Originally, the scriptwriter had given that brilliant line to Frost saying, "We can't accept your surrender." But Frost, the advisor, said, "I didn't say that line. I don't want to take credit for it. Somebody else said it, so I can't let you put that in the movie. I don't want my men thinking that I'm trying to take all the glory for the funny quips." So in the movie, Anthony Hopkins doesn't say it. Instead, his colleague says it, which is much truer to what happened. In the end, though, when their ammunition had run out and they had no chance whatsoever of resisting, Colonel Frost did agree to surrender. The Germans took the 100 or so paratroopers that remained of the 745 that landed into captivity, including Colonel Frost.
Drover, King 6! Mailbox! Speed right 2! We need an airstrike on it! Over! We gotta get the hell out of here! Let's go! Let's go! Let's go!
While the fighting was raging in northwest Europe during Operation Market Garden, at exactly the same time in the Pacific, the Americans had assaulted Peleliu Island, another very importantly positioned island that allowed the Americans to strike in the direction of the Philippines before working their way up to the Japanese home islands. It was attacked by the 1st US Marine Division on September the 15th in an operation that they hoped might just take a couple of days, but would actually last until the end of November. Now, so many of these island battles in the Pacific War are just brutal, but many of the people that were there say this was among the worst. The Japanese decided to fight very cleverly. They built networks of tunnels and caves. They allowed American troops to advance over some of their positions, then they'd emerge from tunnels to attack their rear. It was just a brutal, savage grind for every metre of ground gained. This is from the great TV show The Pacific, and it shows a mortar crew, well, them and their unit, trying to fight their way across an airfield on Peleliu. In these kinds of infantry encounters, the mortar crews are really important because they just allow you to bring a bit of muscle to the battlefield. They're man-portable, so you can carry them in sections, a little team of people to carry the various bits of the mortar and indeed its ammunition. But as you can see, once you set it up, it's like having a little bit of portable artillery with you. You can bring explosive rounds to bear on the target. You can do real damage. So that's why these mortar crews are a key part of these infantry battalions. They're moving forward. You've got people with rifles, you've got people with machine guns, but you can shoot that mortar out of there through a high trajectory, landing those rounds on enemy positions. The battle for Peleliu was hell, apart from anything else. It was hot, it was 46 centigrade, that's about 115 Fahrenheit at times. Their drinking water was tainted with oil, and the Japanese defenders were particularly highly motivated. There were about 10,000 Japanese defenders on the island, and only a handful allowed themselves to be captured. So all of the rest chose suicidal resistance. As a result of the 9,000 Marines that attacked the island, nearly 2,000 became casualties.
Hey, Doc. It's gonna get busy, pal. Hold your fire, boys. Don't let them draw you out. Hold your fire! Stay ready, boys. What the hell are we gonna hit those things with? Stay ready! Hold your fire. Get ready, Walter! Stay in your hole, guys.
Having looked at the Pacific, let's see how the same producers handled the fighting going on in Europe in late 1944. In December of that year, Hitler launched his last crazy offensive on the Western Front. He tried to punch through the Ardennes, which is wooded, mountainous terrain on the border of Luxembourg and Belgium, to try and reach the port of Antwerp. He hoped he could repeat the glory days of 1940. He hoped he could drive a wedge between his enemy, divide them both in half, and then perhaps, if he enjoyed that success, perhaps somehow he could organise some kind of negotiated peace. He could save himself and his regime. It was a desperate hope, and it broke on the tough resistance of the mainly American units that it met along the way. What followed was the so-called Battle of the Bulge, and it's depicted here in Band of Brothers.
Hey, Gene. Let's go. Come on, let's go. Go!
The Bulge was fought in sub-zero temperatures. There was snow, the ground was frozen, very difficult to dig defences into. The Germans did enjoy some early success. They managed to push into Allied lines, which meant that some units found themselves outflanked or even surrounded. One of those units were now the world-famous Easy Company of the 2nd Battalion, the 506th Parachute Infantry of the 101st Airborne Division. They're here in the town of Foy in Belgium. They are surrounded, and their job is just to hold out until the cavalry arrive. One of the great things about Band of Brothers is each episode put slightly different emphasis on different members of the unit, and this one really focuses on the medic, Eugene Rowe. They call him Doc Rowe, and you see how even though the medic might not be firing a weapon, he's not discharging his weapon at the enemy, he is absolutely on the front line and risking his life perhaps even more than those men that do. It's a terrifying scene in many ways. You've got parachute infantry here, so these are light troops. They thought they were being sent to a quiet part of the line to recover from a very busy few months they've had since D-Day, and now here they are in terrible weather, cut off, facing armoured troops. This is a mismatch. On top of that, they haven't got the supplies they need, they haven't got the artillery support they need. The weather's bad, there's low clouds, they haven't got the air support they've relied on to this point. It's really stacked against Easy Company in this scene.
Take the plasma.
All right. Hey. Come on, Walter. Come on, buddy. Hurry, Doc. Come on, Doc. I gotta get back to the line.
Okay. Man.
I've been to these foxholes on the edge of the village that were used in filming Band of Brothers. They're still there, you can go and see them today. And by pure chance, I visited it on a very, very snowy, cold December's day. So this scene all looks very familiar.
I got your ride, Doc.
It was called the Battle of the Bulge because all the Germans managed to achieve was to punch a sort of bulge into Allied lines. Allied High Command quickly reinforced that bulge, and very quickly the Germans were pushed back to their starting position. Hitler had absolutely nothing to show for his last great offensive, apart from he'd used up enormous supplies of men, tanks, and fuel that he didn't have. Well, we finally reached 1945. The Allied troops are just grinding their way into Germany. The Germans are fighting really hard to protect their home soil, even though the war is lost. There's no doubt about it at all. And here in the movie Fury, we see Brad Pitt leading a column of US Sherman tanks on a sweep through the German countryside.
Hard left, reverse!
I'm not sure they'd ever have been this isolated. You wouldn't just get 4 tanks just rolling through hostile country by themselves, because without that infantry support, without those other arms, they're pretty vulnerable.
Go! R6!
The fuck was it?
That was 88.
It's a goddamn tank. What the fuck is it?
So they've been ambushed. A shell has come out and smashed one of those Shermans in the flank, and it has gone up. The Germans used to call Sherman tanks Tommy cookers in the Desert War in North Africa, and they used aviation fuel. They had aircraft engine, which meant that when they were hit, if the fuel caught on fire, they would go up like a cigarette lighter. It was.
What? Shoot that fucker! Firewood ready. Stop!
So the key thing for them to do is try and work out where that came from. They're making smokes, they're putting down smoke to disguise themselves, make it harder for another hit on them, and they're going to try and identify the threat and deal with it.
All right, all tanks, move forward. Fuck.
Get him, right flank. Right steer. David.
Left with me, stay abreast.
Let's go right at him. Order, left flank.
Let's bombardier this cocksucker.
Right steer. Take the right flank. Gerade Ausmarsch. Neues Ziel. Rückgelegt.
First time I was in a movie theatre and I saw that depiction of an 88mm German anti-tank round or shell come past, that shriek, that light, it was terrifying. Brad Pitt's character has worked out that fire is not coming from an 88 gun, as he says, so one of these German anti-aircraft guns that they discovered had a really good anti-armour roll. When they put it flat, trajectory shot along the ground, it could take out enemy tanks very effectively. It's not an 88 gun. Instead, it's a Tiger tank, which is a huge German tank. It has an 88 gun in its turret. It's one of the heaviest tanks produced during the Second World War. Very strongly armoured. It had much more armour than these Sherman tanks. And it was a formidable foe.
Hit him! On one! Pump it!
Barrel's on!
What do you want, Tom?
Over AP, smash!
You're clear, boy! AP, 500 yards! Fire!
The armour on the front of that Tiger was 10 to even 15 centimetres thick, and so those Sherman rounds just bouncing off. In response, a Tiger could take out a Sherman at nearly a kilometre, so 2,500 feet range.
They got Peterson!
It's a fucking beast!
The Tiger tank does look pretty awesome, that's why it's got so many fans. It weighed about 50 tons. They made just over 1,300 of them in the war. Not nearly enough to have had a strategic effect on the outcome of the war. They're also prone to mechanical breakdown. They're very complicated. They need a lot of care and maintenance. So they weren't what Germany necessarily needed at the end of the war.
Bible, stand by. I'll call the shot. Roger, Roger!
Brad Pitt's character has worked out that they're going to be unable to penetrate the front armour of that Tiger, so they're going to try and get round the flanks and hit it from its lesser protected sides and even its rear. That was the only chance they had.
Come on, Bible! Come on, fucking shoot him! Steady! Now! On one! Fuck, ready, one more! One more, Christ! Again! On one! Tight strong. Jesus Christ.
Although people like to say the Tiger was a better tank than the Sherman, in fact, as one of the great expressions of the Second World War goes, quantity has a quality all of its own. So just by sheer numbers of Sherman, they were able to overcome the challenges faced by these Tiger tanks. In February 1945, the Americans had won a major victory in the Philippines. Their next target was Okinawa, north of that and within short striking range from the Japanese home islands themselves. But there was a little bit of a thorn in their side. A tiny volcanic scrap of rock in the Pacific called Iwo Jima. There was an airfield on that island, and fighters based on that island had tried to intercept American heavy bomber raids over the Japanese homeland, and it was felt there's a bit of housekeeping. It would be good to seize the island of Iwo Jima. Intelligence assessed it could be seized in just a couple of days. The result was one of the most terrible battles of the Pacific War, if not in American history, and it's told beautifully by a couple of films produced by Clint Eastwood. The first we're going to have a look at now is called Letters from Iwo Jima, and this scene we're going to look at here shows the US Marines landing on the shores of this black, volcanic, sparsely vegetated island, and initially everything seems to go well, almost too well.
攻撃開始。攻撃開始。攻撃開始。
It's great how this scene shows just how well entrenched the Japanese were. They took every advantage. They hollowed out bunkers built into the volcanic rock. They used camouflage, and they opened up a withering fire on the US Marines that were landing on that beach. And this was just the start of a grueling, brutal battle for this island. It did not take a couple of days to clear this island. It took weeks and tens of thousands of casualties. Flamethrowers are really important in the Pacific War. You need portable weapons that really pack a punch. And flamethrowers could, well, spurt a tongue of flame out over quite a big distance, getting through gaps, getting through small embrasures in pillboxes, and incinerating the unfortunate people inside.
What a hell of a view.
A view from up here, yes, I'd say something safe.
On your way here, am I, Joe?
Hey, Doc, want to get some hand?
Jesus, Bill. Here she goes.
Ready? Ready? Go, go.
You get it?
I don't know. Wish I could have seen their faces.
Nobody even noticed that second flag going up.
We've now got another scene from the movie Flag of Our Fathers, and it's the iconic scene that Eastwood recreates, which is really the moment captured and photographed that we all recognise the Pacific War, and that's the raising of the US flag on the summit of Mount Suribachi. It was supposed to symbolise the capture of the island. In fact, the fighting was going on all over the island, would go on for some time more. But the fact that that flag was raised on top, well, that was a source of enormous relief to many of the sailors, many of the soldiers and Marines engaged in that terrible battle.
What? Frank, what is it?
I don't know, sir.
Hey,
I don't know.
you finished with this war?
Well, we've reached April 1945 now, and while the fight in the Pacific, if anything, is building to a crescendo as the US Marines, US forces get closer and closer to the Japanese home islands, the Soviets in the east are closing the noose around Berlin, about to launch a massive offensive to try and take the capital of the Third Reich. But from the west, Allied troops, American, Canadian, British and others, are advancing fast across swathes of Germany. As they do so, they discover some of the horrific infrastructure of Adolf Hitler's Nazi regime, including concentration camps and murder camps. In this TV series, Band of Brothers, we see an occasion on which Easy Company arrive at a concentration camp. This is based on a real story. They've attempted to be pretty accurate here. This is Kaufering Camp. It's part of the larger Dachau concentration camp system. I think Dachau was one of the oldest camps in the Nazi system. It was established just after Hitler got into power to warehouse enemies of the regime, undesirables. In this camp there would have been political enemies of the Nazis, there would have been homosexuals, there would have been Jews, there would have been prisoners of war. And because the Nazi state was on the verge of collapse, these concentration camps, always hideous places, were now made even worse because supplies of food and medicine hadn't got through. The camp inmates were starving to death, they were disease-ridden, they were being beaten and abused by their German guards. It was a vision of hell.
Major, sir. Open it up. Sir.
Stand back. Give us some room here. Stand back.
You see here the sort of infamous so-called striped pajamas. They were issued to the inmates of concentration camps. They'd often have their hair shaved to try and prevent lice outbreaks, and they would wear those government-issued outfits. It's worth saying in some of the murder camps, those outfits were recycled. So I've talked to survivors of the Holocaust who remembered being given these striped pajamas, and it had been very clear that other people had worn them before, and they could easily imagine what had happened to those former wearers.
Christensen, any of your men speak German?
No, sir.
I need leave guard. Leave guard! Lipton, find me leave guard.
Yes, sir.
Leave guard! Leave guard!
There had been rumours in the West. There had been some reports. Certainly the President, the Prime Minister of Britain, they would have known about elements of the Holocaust. But I think when normal GIs, normal people like Easy Company here, were confronted with the monstrous brutality of the concentration camp system, it blew their minds. They weren't expecting anything like this. And it's reported that it came as a surprise to many of them. This camp that Easy Company discover was by no means the worst camp in the system. When British troops got into Belsen, thousands and thousands of corpses greeted them, and people on the very, very verge of death. About 500 dead were found in this camp, and the Americans forced the local population, local Germans, to come into the camp to see it with their own eyes so they could bear witness, and then to bury those corpses. So they could not feign ignorance. The war in Europe was now in its last days, and that must have finally been apparent to the man who did so much to cause it in the first place and ensured it would be as long and brutal as it was. Adolf Hitler, deep in his bunker, under the earth, in his capital Berlin.
Es ist dem Feind gelungen, die Front in breiter Formation zu durchbrechen. Im Süden hat der Gegner Zossen genommen und stößt auf Stahnsdorf vor. Der Feind operiert jetzt am nördlichen Stadtrand zwischen Frohnau und Pankow, und im Osten ist der Feind bis zur Linie Lichtenberg-Marsdorf-Karlshorst gelangt.
Mit dem Angriff Steiners wird das alles in Ordnung kommen.
Mein Führer, Steiner.
In this stunning movie, Downfall, we see a depiction of the last few days of Adolf Hitler's life. Adolf Hitler has been played on the silver screen many, many times. But I don't think anyone will ever beat this portrayal by Bruno Ganz. The physical decline of Hitler, the shaking hands, the twitches, the temper, the exhaustion. By this stage of the war, Hitler wasn't sleeping properly. He was suffering from multiple overlapping morbidities. He was addicted to a cocktail of drugs. He was totally broken, physically and psychologically. And you see that in this movie.
Das war ein Befehl! Der Angriff Steiners war ein Befehl! Wer schickt Sie? Dass Sie es wagen, sich meinen Befehl zu widersetzen! So weit ist es also gekommen. Das Militär hat mich belogen! Jeder hat mich belogen, sogar die SS! Die gesamte Generalität ist nichts weiter als ein Haufen niederträchtiger, treuloser Feiglinge!
Mein Führer, ich kann nicht zulassen, dass die Soldaten, die für Sie verbringen...
Nicht als Feiglinge! Verreiter, Versager!
Mein Führer, was Sie da sagen, ist ungeheuerlich.
Die Generalität ist das Geschmeiß des deutschen Volkes! Sie ist ohne Ehre!
Hitler was always hoping for a miracle to be his salvation. He was hoping for it all the way, I think, from 1942 onwards. But in this scene, he realises that one of his final hopes, a counterattack by a man called Steiner, just didn't take place. And that's because by this stage of the war, Hitler and his senior commanders are just moving ghost armies around the maps. No longer is anything happening in this bunker really connected to what's actually going on outside. He thinks Steiner's about to advance with a shiny new army. The army just doesn't exist.
Verräter! Von allem Anfang an bin ich so verraten und betrogen worden!
Hitler's really venting here, and he's bringing out a great theme of his leadership, which was that he was always an outsider. He'd been a corporal, one of the lowest ranks of the German military in World War I. And as he'd seized supreme power in Germany, he believed that the aristocratic, the ancient ruling class, the senior officers of the German army had never really accepted him. And they'd only been with him while the going was good. The minute things had gone wrong, they'd been trying to undermine him. Don't forget, a group of them had tried to kill him in 1944 during Operation Valkyrie. And so all of that bile is coming out now. He's blaming the generals for the destruction of the German army. Hitler always liked to find someone else to scapegoat. It was never his fault.
Der Krieg ist verloren.
The atmosphere in the bunker was extraordinary. It was deep underground. It was stuffy. You could hear the diesel generator engine pumping all the time, trying to keep the electricity going, keeping the airflow going. In other levels of the bunker, people had given up entirely. They were breaking into supplies. They were drinking alcohol. They were having sex parties. They were expecting death at any minute. Around Hitler, there was still a charade that he was a warlord and his decisions were actually affecting anything on the outside. But in reality, these were the dying seconds of the regime.
Aber wenn Sie, meine Herren, glauben, dass ich deswegen Berlin verlasse, irren Sie sich gewaltig. Eher jage ich mir eine Kugel durch den Kopf. Tun Sie, was Sie wollen.
At the end of that scene, Hitler admits, finally, that he understands that the war is over. But he says, I won't leave Berlin. I will shoot myself in the head. Or he said, I'd rather shoot myself in the head. And indeed, just a few days later, on April the 30th, Hitler does indeed shoot himself. As Soviet troops were only, well, meters away, the Führer ended his own life and that of his new wife.
Uncle Sam is mild, he's peaceful as a child, but never get him riled or
Cut it out, Hollywood, shut
so
up.
now you want to fight? Well, you better
Shut up. Swear to God, Hollywood, I will shoot you.
Put a sock in it, will you? Save your chrome for women.
As Hitler breathed his last in Europe, the biggest battle of the Pacific War was raging on the island of Okinawa. It began on the 1st of April and it went on for 82 days. The long campaign of island hopping really culminated in Okinawa. If they seized this island, very close to the Japanese home islands, this would be the ideal place to launch that amphibious assault, that D-Day into Japan itself. Remember, nobody portrayed in this movie has the slightest clue that the nuclear bomb has been developed or will be dropped just a month or two later. So they believed that this was the necessary staging post to those ultimate landings in Japan, the conquest of Japan. In this scene here, we get to see Desmond Doss. He is a Seventh-day Adventist, so he's very religious. He's an army medic because he's promised he will never carry a weapon. He's a conscientious objector. He's a pacifist, but he said he will rescue men and seek to save their lives on the battlefield. And this movie really focuses on his bravery in this campaign. But it's set against the backdrop of the bloodiest, the most terrible, the biggest and costliest of all these Pacific Island battles. The Americans would eventually feed about 250,000 combat troops into Okinawa, and tens of thousands of them were killed or wounded. This would have been a typical scene, a new unit arriving on the beach, heading inland towards the front, and an old unit being withdrawn, broken by battle.
survive that shit. Oh, but they can.
Again, like so many movies, you see the preliminary stages of an attack, a battle, gigantic artillery and air bombardment. One of the troops here says, you know, no one can survive that. You see this pall of black smoke, this flame, this high explosive, shrapnel whizzing around. And yet somehow, as someone reminds him, if you're dug in, if you're underground, if you've got pre-prepared positions, you can survive that weight of fire. And there's no alternative but to go and sweep through with infantry, do the hard work of clearing those positions, bunker by bunker, pit by pit. And that's what these troops have got to do here at the Battle of Hacksaw Ridge, the Siege of Hacksaw Ridge, one of the most infamous moments of Okinawa. This movie shows Hacksaw Ridge as a savage cliff that you've got to climb with this netting. In reality, it was a very prominent escarpment. It was a really powerful feature that dominated the battlefield. And there was no alternative but for the infantry to go up and over it, and it was well defended by the Japanese. He just says, you know, I can't see them, where the hell are they? And that's what we hear about Okinawa. So well camouflaged, so well dug in. They'd been expecting that attack for months. They'd had a lot of time to prepare. They'd created just killing zones to funnel US troops into those places, and then they could be lacerated with crossfire, pre-prepared, pre-sighted artillery rounds landing on the troops. It was one of the toughest challenges of the Second World War.
Arms up!
You gotta be kidding me, Cornstalk.
You're tying a bowline, boy, and I'm building a bra. Come on.
During that battle, Desmond Doss saved 75 men by lowering them on ropes down that cliff face back to safety. So he becomes the first conscientious objector ever to receive the Congressional Medal of Honor. Extraordinary achievement. This is the kind of fighting that the Allies were expecting to have to wage as they invaded the Japanese home islands. Well-sighted defences, a challenging terrain, and a fanatical local population and defensive force that would make the Americans fight for every inch of ground that they gained. That, thankfully, never happened, in large part because of the atomic bomb. July 1945, the US had just conducted the first successful test of a nuclear bomb in history. Trinity, the Trinity test. It saw this bomb detonated in the New Mexico desert, and it is brilliantly realized in this scene from the movie Oppenheimer. It was 5:29 in the morning of July the 16th, 1945. We see Cillian Murphy playing Oppenheimer, Robert Oppenheimer, the chief physicist, the man who was running the Manhattan Project, the project to try and make a nuclear weapon that was usable on the battlefield. He watches the detonation. It was like nothing else in history. For 300 meters around the point of detonation, it turned the desert sand into glass. In fact, a new material, which is named trinitite as a result. Eyewitnesses say that the surrounding mountains were made bright as day for a few seconds after the explosion. And then they report extraordinary heat that was emitted from this bomb.
And now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
It's a great depiction of the fact that it took 40 seconds from the detonation for the roar and the punch of the shockwave to reach the people that were watching. And it didn't stop there. That shockwave would be felt over 100 miles away. They went to great effort to make sure this scene was realistic. They actually shot it in the New Mexico desert. And they didn't use any CGI. They used no special effects in the creation of that mushroom cloud. They used a variety of different techniques. They shot from very, very close up on a range of cameras just to make that as realistic as possible. Now that the Americans had the ability to deploy nuclear weapons on the battlefield, the decision eventually was made to drop 2 nuclear weapons, one on the Japanese city of Hiroshima, another on Nagasaki. Those were in early August 1945. Combined with the Soviet invasion of the Japanese Empire in northern China, it was very clear that the game was up for Japan. And eventually, reluctantly, the Japanese agreed to unconditional surrender. The final instrument of surrender was signed aboard a US battleship in Tokyo Bay in September 1945, almost exactly 6 years after the war in Europe had started. The largest, most destructive war in history had come to an end, one that has fascinated people all over the world ever since, and that's reflected by the fact that filmmakers have gone back to the war again and again for inspiration to make some of the most epic movies of all time. Thank you for watching this massive survey, the story of World War II as told through its movies. It's been a passion project for lots of us at History Hit over the years. I'm glad we finally got this out. Please let us know if you feel we've missed out on any movies in the comments below, and make sure you like and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Thanks so much for watching.